we please close the doors? The committee will come to order. Today we have a joint hearing of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform and the Committee on Natural Resources. The hearing is entitled, "As Difficult as Possible, the National Park Service Implementation of the Government Shutdown." With the indulgence of the Chair and Ranking Member of the Resources Committee, the Oversight Committee's mission statement: we exist to secure two fundamental principles. First, Americans have a right to know the money Washington takes from them is well spent. And second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works on their behalf. Our duty on the Government Oversight and Government Reform Committee is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold government accountable to taxpayers, because taxpayers have a right to know that the money government takes from them is well spent. Our responsibility is to work tirelessly in partnership with citizens and watchdog groups to deliver the facts to the American people and bring a genuine reform to the Federal bureaucracy. This is our mission statement, and during a government shutdown, more than ever, we take that seriously. The National Park Service is a steward of the most treasured public spaces. Indeed, the Park Service is the caretaker of our national heritage. As such, it has always been called on to act in the best interest of the American people and to never allow itself to be subjected to political influence or to work in any way other than on behalf of the American people and these treasured assets. Yet it appears today the Park Service leadership is no longer living up to that mandate. First, allow me to say I support fully the funding of the National Park Service for fiscal year 2013 levels and the appropriation bill that would reopen the parks and fully fund, as was passed on a bipartisan basis on October 2nd. Notwithstanding that the Senate has not taken up that bill, every Republican member of both of these committees and 3 Democratic members did vote for that legislation. I understand that this is a confrontational time. This is a time in which issues other than the Park Service and its assets are being argued. We're not here to argue that today. We're here simply to discover whether or not the Park Service has met its legal obligation, on one hand, under the lack of an appropriations bill, and on the other hand, has done everything it can to mitigate damage to the American people. During the lapse of appropriations, it is proper for non-essential park personnel and services to be suspended. However, it is clear that the lack of money does not mean that one park in America is required to close. As we speak to Director Jarvis today, I regret that he would not come voluntarily and had to be subpoenaed and served by the marshals. This is not the normal way that we do business with any administration official. Why did the Park Service barricade the Lincoln Memorial? Why, when I asked the police standing duty there personally, did they tell me that every policeman was on duty, they were essential, and their job was to keep people out? I repeat, an open-air monument was guarded by the same number of people to prevent Americans from getting in as would allow them to safely go in and out on a daily basis. Why were veterans turned away from the Vietnam Veterans Memorial? Why were honor flights initially told that they must cancel their planned visits? Why were members of the Americans' finest generation in their 80s and 90s turned away and told they could not visit what would be undoubtedly, in many cases, their last time, those monuments? Why were private businesses and nonprofits operating near parkland shuttered? Why, in fact, did the Park Service spend money to stop commerce rather than spend no money and allow commerce to go forward? Why is the Park Service closing roads that run through parkland but are used for local traffic? Why, in fact, would America ever expect that a public road necessary for ingress and egress and safety of a city, a town, or private residence ever be non-essential? We will hear from the Director today. Whatever he wants to say would justify stopping the public from using a public road. I doubt that I, in fact, will agree with him, but I certainly would like to hear his statement for why, in fact, these punitive measures were taken at no savings to the American people. Why, in short, is the shutdown so different than 1995 and 96? The lessons learned in 1995 and 96 should be the basic starting point for can we do better at a time without fundings and limited authority, rather than many facilities that successfully stayed open now being closed. One anonymous Park Service ranger told the Washington Times, "We've been told to make life as difficult for people as we can. It is disgusting." If true, and I have no reason to doubt the truthfulness of that quote, it is indeed disgusting and despicable that the Park Service would do this. But Director Jarvis, you're not here for the first time. During sequestration, we found a pattern of if someone said they could live with existing staff, that they had already had attrition to cover sequestration, that wasn't good enough. They had to send an alternate report. In fact, many of your lieutenants found that they were almost punished for thinking in advance and preparing for possibility of that lower amount under sequestration. During the Occupy program, you came before our committee, one of our committees, and made it very clear that you were going to reinterpret the First Amendment to include basically people sleeping in the parks, defecating on the lawn, creating a health hazard for the people of the District of Columbia, and in fact would do nothing about it. You likened it to previous events rather than likening it to people who were simply sleeping in the park. We disagreed with you then, and we disagree with you now. But I hope today we will have a healthy dialogue that gives you an opportunity to tell us why you have performed, and the Park Service under your leadership has performed less well on behalf of the American people during this shutdown than the one we had more than a decade ago. With that, I recognize the Ranking Member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I will start today by asking a very obvious question. What in the world are we doing here? Today is the 16th day since House Speaker John Boehner shut down the United States government. He could end the shutdown this morning, like right now, by simply allowing the House of Representatives to vote on legislation to reopen the government. This bill has already passed the Senate and has more than enough votes to pass the House. But Speaker Boehner refuses to bring it to the House floor without the support of a majority of his own political party. In other words, if Speaker Boehner brought this bill to the House floor today, it would pass with about 24 Republicans and most, if not all, Democrats. Since he does not have 51% of the Republican Party, Speaker Boehner refuses to allow any vote on this bill. That is why we are still in this government shutdown. That is why people say Speaker Boehner is holding our country hostage. And that is why the American people correctly blame House Republicans for shutting down the government. Their approach puts the ideology of one political party ahead of the interests of our entire nation. Even worse, if this issue is not resolved in the next few hours, we will begin defaulting on our debts, something our nation has never done before. As House Republicans drive our nation towards the fiscal cliff, credit rating agencies are warning that the full faith and credit of our nation is now at risk, and investors are dumping Treasury bills. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle are truly concerned about the shutdown. Allow us to end it. Stop this madness right now. Let us bring the clean Senate bill to the House floor and let us pass it. You can still vote against it, but don't bring down our entire government just because you do not want to allow a vote. Rather than allowing us to take this reasonable course of action, House Republicans today want to focus on restricted access to the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. So let me address this issue directly. The World War II Memorial is a stunning and beautiful monument, but it is made of marble and fountains. Do you know what a more significant tribute to our veterans is? Do you know what really honors our nation's heroes for their service and for their sacrifice? Providing them with the benefits they earned after suffering injuries in combat, paying them the pensions they need to cover their rent, their utility bills, their food, and guaranteeing the assistance they rely on to stay off the streets and, in some cases, to simply stay alive. That is how we make good on our promises to veterans. We take care of them like they took care of us. They gave their blood, their sweat, and their tears, in some instances, all they had. Yesterday, a nonpartisan coalition of 33 veterans groups held a rally at the World War II Memorial. And Gary Augustine, the executive director of the Disabled American Veterans, explained the importance of these benefits to veterans across the country. This is what he said. For many, those payments may be the primary and only source of income. Also yesterday, John Schultz, an Army veteran who started VoteVets.org after serving 2 tours in Iraq, said this, and I quote, "If you lost both your legs in Vietnam and you're on prosthetics and you're 100% connected disabled, you don't get a disability check because the Republicans have hijacked the government over Obamacare," end of quote. I will conclude by reading from a statement issued on October 3rd by 2 of the most distinguished World War II veterans ever to serve in Congress, Republican Bob Dole, Senator Bob Dole, and Democratic Representative John Dingell, who were both instrumental in creating the World War II Memorial. This is what they said, and I quote, "As two proud World War II veterans, blessed also to serve this great nation in Congress, we consider it our bipartisan work together in helping to create a National World War II Memorial to be among our greatest accomplishments and a true honor to our brothers in arms. If this Congress truly wishes to recognize the sacrifice and bravery of our World War II veterans and all who've come after, it will end this shutdown and reopen our government now. The current shutdown has slowed the rate at which the government can process veterans' disability claims, and as the VA has stated, it is negatively impacting other services to our nation's veterans. Piecemeal or partial spending plans do not adequately ensure that our veterans, and indeed all Americans, have access to the system of self-government established to serve and protect them," end of quote. Mr. Chairman, we are out of time. I understand that the Senate will make one more attempt this morning to resolve this issue on a bipartisan basis. I just hope and I pray that Speaker Boehner will finally put our nation first, that he will put this bill on the floor and allow us to vote so we can avert default and reopen our government before it is too late. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the Chairman of the full Committee on Resources, Mr. Hastings.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you and your staff for the cooperation as we put together this, this joint hearing. Now, back to the issue at hand. The issue at hand is difficult as possible the National Park Service implementation of the government shutdown. To anyone trying to follow or make sense of the National Park Service's policies during this unfortunate government shutdown, I would say good luck. The policies have been arbitrary, inconsistent, and ever-changing. Their actions appear to be motivated by two things. One, an attempt to make the shutdowns as painful and as visible as possible, and two, because of one and the backlash, an attempt to squash the ensuing bad PR. That's no way to run a government agency and no way to treat the American people across the country who visit, live, or work on our national park land. The actions of the Obama administration have sullied our great national park system. In their most egregious act, the National Park Service erected barricades around open-air parks and memorials, areas that are open 24/7, 365 days a year. This is in direct contradiction to what happened during the last government shutdown 17 years ago. The Obama administration's barricading of these sites is not something that they are required to do. It is something that they are choosing to do. Furthermore, they appear to only be barricading the highly visible sites. For example, the Lincoln Memorial and the World War II Memorial are barricaded, but people are currently free to walk around the Washington, D.C. World War I Memorial and the Japanese Americans Memorial, both open sites. Thus far, we've heard excuses from the Obama administration ranging from trash collection and maintenance to security concerns. Yet, one by one, it's been confirmed that these excuses are excuses. The mayor of Washington, D.C. declared that they will collect trash in the national parks around the city. As for security, it's been reported that there are just as many National Park police working along the National Mall now as before the shutdown. So from my perspective, there is no reason for these barricades. To add to that, the National Park Service selective reversal of policies has been even more confusing. For example, the administration realized its mistake only after public pressure built. As a result, they agreed to allow World War II veterans with the Honor Flight programs to visit their memorial and exercise their First Amendment rights. Now, while this is very good news for these veterans, it is not appropriate for the National Park Service to be denying these same rights to others who want to visit these open-air parks and memorials. This administration has also forced privately operated sites and businesses to close just because they happen to be located on public lands. These are businesses that don't receive a dime of taxpayer dollars to operate. But once again, after intense public and legal pressure, the Park Service has suddenly allowed some of these sites to reopen while others, with no explanation, remain closed. I hope to hear from our witnesses today about why this was allowed to happen in the first place and what changed to prompt the Park Service's sudden reversal. In addition, the Obama administration first refused to allow states to pay to keep national parks in their respective states open. But what is now becoming a recurring theme, the Park Service suddenly changed their mind after more than a week, again, of public backlash. I do want to point out that during the last government shutdown in 95-96, states were allowed to pay to keep the national parks open and were later reimbursed by the federal government. There is absolutely no reason why it should be any different this time under this administration. Erroneous claims by the Interior Department that they can't pay and may not be able to reimburse states simply defy history. At today's hearing, we expect to get answers, not excuses, and to get to the bottom of when and how all these arbitrary decisions were made and by whom. The past 2.5 weeks have also raised broader questions about how the National Park Service is run. This shouldn't be the only time we take a look at how the Park Service operates and interacts with all states, counties, private businesses, and private property owners. The Committee on Natural Resources expects to continue its oversight of the Park Service's actions as we have with other federal land management agencies. And with that, I'll yield back my time.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the ranking member from Oregon, Mr. DeFazio.
I thank the Chairman. You know, normally I begin these hearings by thanking my Republican colleagues for holding a hearing, inviting witnesses to testify on important issues before the Congress, but, you know, that's not appropriate today. The Republican majority closed down the federal government in a vain attempt to repeal or delay the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, as they call it. Well, we're 15 days into a Republican-initiated government shutdown, and now the Republicans want to investigate why the national parks are shut down. Our nation is already threatened with a credit downgrade, close to the point of default, because the Republicans have linked their shutdown now to the debt limit and could trigger the first default in our nation's history. And here we are holding a hearing on why the Republican government shutdown led to a shutdown of our national parks. Instead of trying to prevent economic hardship, potential financial catastrophe, we're having a hearing that is at best nonsensical. I'm going to spend my time talking about how this Seinfeld shutdown, or the shutdown about nothing, has kept hunters out of refuges, crabbers out of the fishing season, loggers off our timberlands, and citizens out of our national parks. When you decided to shut down the government over 2 weeks ago, did you forget the national park system, which includes memorials, is part of the federal government? No, you knew that, but you apparently forgot the economic impact our iconic parks have in gateway communities, and you forgot that the American people value their public lands and the solemn tribute of the World War II and other war memorials. The title of this so-called hearing is laughable. As difficult as possible, the National Park Service's implementation of the government shutdown. If you want to spend your time here dissecting individual decisions about what monuments are open, which are closed, let me save you some time. Our national park system is surprisingly part of our national government, which you shut down, and I'm going to demonstrate, if the Republican side would look at me, I will show you who's responsible. Right here. Here you are. Who's responsible for shutting down the national parks and memorials. Guess what? The Republican-caused government shutdowns irresponsible, cause incredible economic hardships for the public servants you have put out of work. And yes, it's painful. It's painful for every single American. And that's why we don't shut the government down on a year-to-year basis. This hearing is a sideshow. It's political theater. Are we meeting here today to amplify the efforts of Senator Cruz, Senator Lee, and Sarah Palin last Sunday on the networks? Do we really need to give a platform for a group of people cheering when their leader, Larry Klayman, said, quote, wage a second American nonviolent revolution to use civil disobedience to demand that this president leave town, to get up, to put the Koran down, to get up off his knees, to figuratively come out with his hands up while others went to the White House waving Confederate flags? Maybe the majority wants to give a megaphone to groups like the Competitive Enterprise Institute. They're here today. They once called expanding our federal estate rural cleansing. Really? Rural cleansing? Our parks, our monuments, that was rural cleansing. You'd take them away, you'd give them back, you'd sell them. Well, you can continue to engage in your irresponsible talk and try and make the Park Service and our park rangers the target of your own ineptitude and intransigence. But we're not going to play that game. I would yield the balance of my time to Representative Grijalva.
Thank you, Mr. DeFazio. Let me just concur that we seem to be here at this hearing functioning in an alternative universe. We have the Republican majority in their leadership that created the shutdown. We have the Republican majority in their leadership that can't manage the shutdown. And we have the Republican majority in their leadership that can't get us out of the shutdown. So what do? We have a hearing. And today the majority holds this feeble hearing to scapegoat Director Jarvis and blame him for the fact that they can't cope with reality. The national parks, as Mr. DeFazio said, are part of our government. People love them. People depend on them. Economies depend on them. But to avoid reality of the shutdown, or the responsibility for that, is to neglect the job that we have as members of Congress, and thus far this majority has neglected it consistently. And with that, I yield back.
The gentleman.
Mr. Chairman, I want to recognize the chairman of the National Parks Subcommittee on Natural Resources, the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Jarvis, and our witnesses. I don't know whether it was on purpose or whether it just happens to appear that way, but it seems to be our policy towards our public lands has been vindictive and petty and politicized. I wonder why the cooperation of the 90s does not exist. But what is very clear is that there is a better way. What we have seen are that the states are willing to step up and help people when Washington fails, not just when Congress fails, but when the agencies fail at the same time. I'm very proud that when your department ordered the the federal lands that are administered and run by the state of Wisconsin to close down, the governor basically said no, that he would run those regardless. I'm proud of the governors in Arizona and Utah and South Dakota and Colorado who have stepped up to pay to have those parks functioning. What we have simply found is that when the states and local governments are involved in the management of our public lands, it is a better process. If you look in the state of Utah, the Sand Flats, which is a wonderful recreation area, this time BLM property, that the BLM could not manage, didn't have the resources to manage, nor the desire. And when a near riot broke out one time in the recreation area, they might decided to work with the county to come up with a county-managed plan, which is now a wonderful recreation area that not only provides opportunities for people to recreate, but is done without a cost to the taxpayer at the same time. The coral pink sand dunes in southern Utah is land that has been given back to the state of Utah, even though there is some federal land there, and is managed as one newspaper reported, one of the 10 wonders, 10 unheralded parks in the nation. It's a great opportunity, simply because local government was given the opportunity to be involved in the management process. In our hearings, we've already shown how the forests in Idaho and Washington on state land are far more productive, have far less wildfires, and are much healthier than the federal land that is right next door. The same thing happens on Park Service land and BLM land. And what we need to realize is that this shutdown has illustrated there is a better way, and that better way is the involvement of state and local governments in the management of our public lands, so that this kind of situation does not necessarily have to happen. And what we need is to look forward in that. What I find as so frustrating, though, in due respect, is that this situation in which we find ourselves is not necessarily unique to the shutdown. This has been happening for those of us who live in the Intermountain West for years. When the Park Service harms outfitters and guides by insisting that their insurance payments have to go up from a $1 to a $5 million policy, prohibiting them from doing issue. When a park in Washington bans an annual church picnic and concert for veterans because the noise that would be established would be too loud for the cultural and historic aspects of the rest of the park. When Park Service personnel says a murder victim in Nevada cannot be found, and the family wants to hire somebody to go in and look, and it takes them 15 months to raise the money to pay for the special use permit, and then when they go in, they find that body within 2 hours after the Park Service said it was impossible. Or an Air Force staff sergeant who was drowned at that same park, and the Park Service refuses to allow a private company that is an expert in underwater recovery to go in and find the body. It takes 10 months for the family to finally get a lawyer and go to court, and then when it's allowed, that body is found within a matter of days. When on a wild and scenic recreation river, the Park Service decides to ban all sorts of paddling and oars, so that the only, and obviously electronic motors, so the only thing you can do for recreation, I guess, is fish watching. When the Park Service writes a statement about the Keystone Pipeline being an endanger to its park land, and the closest land is 30 miles away, what we have found is there is a pattern, not just in this shutdown, but a pattern that has recurred year after year and has been exacerbated in the last few. And I find that disgusting and disheartening, to say the least. There is a better way. The states have stood up and shown that they can be better managers of the land, and if we really want to have a long-range policy for public lands in the future, we have to incorporate cooperation with states and local government and allow them to have a greater say in the management of our public lands. Federalism is the solution to our problems, and it may even be the salvation of this country. I thank the gentleman from Washington, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, an area very much affected by this shutdown, for 5 minutes.
Indeed, the District of Columbia is a double whammy victim of this shutdown, and blaming the National Park Service for closing the parks is like voting for capital punishment and then blaming the hangman as executions proceed. Locally, the district cannot meet the payment coming up for its charter schools. We cannot pay for disabled children in group homes because our local funds are held here. And this, in addition to the national parks, which fund our tourist economy, that has collapsed. So the District of Columbia's local funds shouldn't even be here, and certainly our local economy dependent on the opening of all of our monuments should not now be collapsed because Republicans have shut down the federal government. And I yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Hold'em, New Jersey.
I thank the gentlelady. Early this morning, I spoke with my 100-year-old mother, and she asked what we would be doing today in Congress. And I said I was going to hope to find that the Republican side found some backbone and got their act together to get the government operating. And she said, it sounds like you're going to have a long day. Well, over the last 2 weeks, the Republicans seem surprised to find out that the federal government actually does things to help people, but they can't agree on what to do about it. So today they found something they can agree on, which is blaming someone else for what they've done. So the federal government does perform very tangible functions. And when it's disrupted in a disrupting way, an abrupt way, you know, you find people affected in ways that weren't predicted. The solution is quite simple. They could bring a vote to the House this morning. It would pass. Everything would be fixed. The barricades would be down. The hardworking members would be back to work.
Mr. Conley.
With that, I yield time to Mr. Conley.
I thank the gentleman. We are in a Kafka novel.
He gets to yield to Mr.
The federal government is shut down. We're on the brink of the first default on the creditworthiness, sovereign debt of the United States. And we're going to have a hearing to pillory Director Jarvis because he shut down national parks after the Republican majority shut down the government. Imagine their shock that there would be consequences, that their favorite place to picnic is closed, and that the National Park Service is in fact enforcing it. And we saw that shameful moment where a member of the Republican caucus actually berated a National Park Service ranger for doing her job. This is a Kafkaesque moment. And the solution isn't to have a hearing to pillory somebody for doing his job. The solution is to reopen this government without condition, to avoid default without condition, and get on with the business of governance before we destroy all confidence in this legislative body. And with that, I yield to my colleague, Ms. Bordallo.
Thank you very much. I wonder how many Republicans really thought about the far-reaching effects of this shutdown. Nationwide, this shutdown has furloughed more than 20,000 National Park Service employees, 21 of them of which work for the War in the Pacific National Historic Park on Guam, that small island in the Pacific. I wonder how many thought about that. So only 2 employees remain on duty there to provide security and emergency services, and we have 600 visitors daily. The shutdown has negatively impacted Guam's tourism economy for something that could have been avoided entirely by passing a clean CR. We have failed in this Congress, our National Park Service employees and our nation. And I have made this point repeatedly at House Armed Services and will continue to do so until this Republican-led shutdown is completed. And I'll end my remarks with saying, let's shut down the shutdown. And I yield my time to Representative Tsongas.
Thank you, Director Jarvis, for appearing before the committee today. As you know, my district is home to 2 great national parks, and I know firsthand how devastating this shutdown has been for our local economy, for hundreds of school children who haven't had access to the parks, and for our dedicated park employees who have been furloughed. Overall, millions of Americans
The gentlelady's time has expired. Would you please conclude?
Well, I think that if you really care about opening the national parks, about putting our government workers back to work, that we could have a vote today on a clean CR that would fund government and avoid a default for the first time
I thank the
in the history
gentlelady.
of this country.
All members may have 7 days in which to submit opening statements for the record. And as I recognize the panel, I would admonish all members that House rules prohibit questioning the intent or the character of another member of the House or the Senate. So as we go through this hearing, you may quote from statements made, but the intent of a member or adverse attempt is not admissible. Additionally, I now ask unanimous consent that the USA Today article of last night, GOP asked, where the national parks shut down, or why would the national parks shut down anyway, be entered in the record. Without objection, so ordered. We now recognize our panel of witnesses. Mr. Greg Bryan is mayor of Tucson, not to be confused with the other similar name in Arizona. Ms. Ann Eberly is the managing director of the Claude Moore Colonial Farm. Mr. Jonathan Jarvis is director of the National Park Service. Ms. Lisa Simon is the president of the National Tour Association. Mr. Myron Ebel is director of Energy and Global Warming Policy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. And Mr. Dennis Galvin is a member of the Board of Trustees of the National Parks Conservation Association. Pursuant to the rules of the Oversight Committee, I would ask that all members rise, raise their right hands, and be sworn.
You never see this.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Please be seated. Let the record reflect that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. We have a large panel today, and in order to, on both sides of the dais, and in order to allow time, I would ask that you limit your opening statements to 5 minutes. Your entire opening record, plus any other submissions you think pertinent to your testimony, will be placed in the record. And with that, I now recognize Mayor Bryan.
Thank you, Chairman Issa, Chairman Hastings, Ranking Members Cummings and DeFazio, and Congressman here, and also like to recognize Congressman Gosar for his assistance in many ways as well. I come before you today wearing 2 hats. I'm both the mayor of our small town of 558 people, 3 years old, Arizona's newest community, and also that of a general manager of a rather nice 250-room hotel. And our little town is located on the southern boundary of Grand Canyon National Park. We exist for one reason. We exist because Grand Canyon National Park brings 4.5 million people a year to visit it. Without the park being there, there's no reason for our community. We're a tourism industry. We're dependent upon the tourism industry, and without that park open, we basically are shut down. We have a good relationship with our park. We appreciate Superintendent Ubaraga and his team. We recognize that those workers, those rangers, are there because they choose to serve and to share this beautiful, wonderful resource. And we know that this shutdown has impacted them in many ways, as well as our community. And we recognize that relationship and want to protect that relationship. At the same time, we feel like we have significantly been impacted by the decisions to close down the government and our national park. The month of October is a very wonderful month. It's a beautiful month to be in Grand Canyon. When we started out, it was 90+% occupancy at the end of September, reservations on the books ready to come. Our river outfitters had, I believe, 7 or 8 trips worth $900,000 ready to go down the Colorado River. Today, I'll tell you that at least in one hotel, we're in the low 40% and dropping. We've lost over $400,000 in one place alone. The impact to our community has been in the millions of dollars within a very short time. All this because elected members of Congress and the President can't come to grips with passing and getting a budget going. In the meantime, we in the front line feel kind of like cannon fodder. We feel like we're the ball bouncing back and forth, and we're the ones that are paying the bill. Suddenly, our source of business, our source of income for our little community is closed October 1st. We immediately began to ask questions with regard to how we can do it, how we can get our park back open. In 1995, same thing happened, and within a reasonably short period of time, there was an agreement worked out between the National Park Service, Department of Interior, and our Governor, Fife Symington. That application, that policy could have been easily put into place. We don't understand why it wasn't. It could have been pulled out, dusted off, changed to apply today, and then applied. But we went out and asked, and we offered to put up funds. Within a very short time, our little town, 558 people, put up $200,000 out of our coffers as a community. Within a few more days, we had well over $200,000 committed from business community in our area and across the state. We were willing to put up and fund the expenses at no cost to the National Park Service to keep portions of the park open. We weren't asking for a full opening, we were asking for partial. We were asking that Highway 64, a primary conduit through the National Park, comes up from I-40, a connection between Albuquerque and Los Angeles, heavily traveled, tour buses, RVs. Our connection, Highway 64, runs through the town of Tucson, goes into the park, and turns east to connect to a Highway 89, which then goes into many other national parks and monuments. The first couple of days it was left open, and we thank Superintendent Ubarraga for that. But the plan that was used was doomed to fail at the beginning. We were allowing people to traverse through the park. Everything else was closed, but the parking spaces alongside the road were barricaded. It's kind of like offering a piece of candy to somebody and say, you can't open it. You can't open it. They're going to find a way. Their frustration was there. Therefore, the buses, tour buses, RVs, and personal cars were parking either on the shoulders or in the road to take a look at this great, magnificent World Heritage Site. We understand that, and we agree with the superintendent when he closed it because it was unsafe. We feel that, and we had offered, the Coconino County Sheriff's Department said they would assist, and they have concurrent jurisdiction inside the park, offered to help patrol and keep it safe. Open up the parking spaces, allow people to at least view. We offered to put up porta potties to help keep things reasonably clean. We were told no. We asked why. We couldn't apply the thing in the agreement in 1995. It's against National Park Service or Department of Interior Administration's policy. We never quite got it clear. We were told that either all the parks open or none of the parks open. We have concerns about that. And we believe that when a national park is closed, that the individuals in the community, if they come forward and are offered to help and to support, ought to be able to open that. We really appreciate the work of Governor Jan Brewer and her efforts to reopen the park, and we were very ecstatic last Saturday morning in a beautiful blue sky to open up, with the superintendent's help, Grand Canyon National Park for business again. We look forward to having some changes after this shutdown is done and come back to you and request some options with regard to clarifying a policy that says we be able to, in a community that wants to stand up, take responsibility, be accountable when the government won't, and pay the bills. We think the policy ought to be clarified to allow that to take place. I can tell you from being on the front lines, when you have a family come in from South Africa or Australia or Brazil or China, in many cases planning for 10 years to bring their children and experience that, and you got to tell them at 7 o'clock at night after they've driven all that way that you can't go in the national park, you can't see it. Well, why not? And with tears streaming down the children's face, we got to tell them because our government has shut it down. We need to find different ways of doing this, and we would really appreciate the time afterwards to talk about a potential for the future of creating a clarity of the policy that would allow a national park to be run, not run, but assisted in the expenses covered by a local community. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Ms. Epperly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, for your invitation. I'm really honored to be here. I'm the Managing Director of the Claude Moore Colonial Farm in McLean. I'm representing our staff, volunteers, and visitors here. The farm is a living history site that shows the life of a poor family in 1771, struggling to survive while fight for freedom is growing around them. The farm is also a privately operated national park unit of the George Washington Memorial Parkway. I've been involved with the farm since 1972, first as a volunteer, then as an employee of the Park Service, helping to establish the farm, which opened to the public in 1973. Due to cuts in national park funding in 1981, the farm's public programs were going to be eliminated, and subsequently the farm became privately operated by the nonprofit organization Friends of the Farm. At the same time, I resigned my Park Service position to manage the farm for the Friends and have been there ever since. I came here today because I thought it might not only help the farm, but maybe even help other groups like us. Along with many other national park partners, we've been severely affected by the recent closing of our site as part of the continuing government shutdown. Fortunately, we were allowed to reopen on Wednesday of last week, but most others have not been so lucky. We still don't know why we were closed, nor do we know why we were allowed to open a week later. The farm has never been included in government shutdowns, as there are no Park Service employees at the farm, nor have there been since 1981. During the previous shutdown almost 20 years ago, it made sense that if NPS personnel couldn't be paid to staff the parks couldn't open. No one was happy about that, but people understood. This time, the NPS chose to close areas to the public that don't depend on NPS personnel. Locally, that included us, a ball field at the end of our road leased to Fairfax County and rented to children's sports groups, the scenic overlooks on the north end of the parkway, and of course, the closing down of the Veterans Memorials on the National Mall. I realize that in the proverbial heat of battle, someone could make decisions that have unintended consequences. But wasn't anyone watching the news? Couldn't someone have come forward and admit they had made a huge mistake? As the managing director of the farm, I've had to deal with people that are unhappy, fortunately not very often, and I have a choice. I can be defensive, or I can immediately reach out and say, I am so sorry that your experience at the farm wasn't perfect. How can we make this right? And how can we make sure we never do it again? Within a few emails or phone calls, that person has now become a friend of ours, not an enemy. And if I can't bring myself to do that, then I shouldn't be the director of the farm. I don't know who was responsible for the National Park Service actions this time. Maybe it was the White House, the Department of the Interior, maybe the Park Service acted entirely on their own, or maybe no one is in charge there. But the results of the National Park Service looks foolish and inept, and not worthy of managing the immense natural and cultural resources entrusted to them. As a lifelong Virginian, my big park is Shenandoah, which is a wonderful place, one of the very few unspoiled natural areas close to lots of people. Out of the entire year, October is the month. Everybody goes there to look at the leaves. The people who work for the concessions in the park and the businesses that depend on the visitors to that area are in terrible trouble. Their season is basically over by the end of this weekend. Virginia acquired much of that land and then gave it to the Federal Government to become part of the national park system. I'm sure there are people in Richmond now, just like in the Western Park, saying, well, if you can't open it, maybe we can. For the Claude Moore Colonial Farm, being treated with disdain and contempt by the National Park Service is nothing new, and the details are in my written testimony. And if you're interested, I have all the documents to back up everything I wrote. The volunteer staff and public who care about the farm just want to get on with running the farm and doing the very best job that we can. What we do is hard enough, and we are just asking for fairness, honesty, and a partner that doesn't stab us in the back at every opportunity. I don't know what the future holds for the farm, as our original 1981 NPS agreement is up for renewal in 2016. I have been told the process now of developing a new agreement will take at least 3 years, and agreements now only last for 5 years. That means almost as soon as we sign a new agreement, we will have to start negotiating the next one. In addition, the loss of the NPS maintenance contribution to the farm this year will have to come from somewhere. And of course, we will have to make up the revenue that was lost because of the recent closure of the farm. But we are hopeful that we can find a way through these latest difficulties and that the farm will emerge stronger and more committed than ever. We have only turned to our Congressman Wolf and Congressman Moran a few times over the years to help us in working with the National Park Service. The opportunity to come before so many of you was just too good a chance to pass up. And I'm happy to do anything I can to help fix it.
Thank you. And thank you for your service, both public and private. Director Jarvis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On October the 1st, the National Park Service began to implement a shutdown of our activities due to the lapse in appropriations. Under the closure determination notice that I issued that day, we closed and secured all 401 national parks across the country and furloughed more than 20,000 of our employees consistent with the Anti-Deficiency Act. Approximately 3,000 employees were accepted from this furlough to respond to threats to the safety of human life and the protection of property. Absent appropriations, the National Park Service will continue to implement the approved contingency plan that was made public on September 27th. The closure has had far-reaching impacts across the country on families with planned visits, businesses, gateway communities, and employees. The National Park System welcomes more than 282 million people per year and more than 700,000 people per day in October. The parks are loved not only because they are beautiful and historic, but because they are well managed, protected, and interpreted and maintained by a professional workforce, a workforce that is now largely on furlough. The national parks are incredible economic drivers. Visitor spending generates an estimated $32 million per day in communities near national parks and contributes $76 million each day to the national economy. In response to the economic impacts of the closures, Secretary Jewell announced on October 10th that Interior would consider agreements with governors who indicate an interest and an ability to fully fund the National Park Service personnel to reopen national parks in their states. This is a practical and temporary solution that will lessen the pain for some businesses and communities. Turning away visitors is not our culture nor our DNA. We look forward to reopening all 401 national parks. The closure did not apply to through roads in parks that provided primary access between points located outside of the parks, such as Rock Creek Parkway. It also did not affect First Amendment activities on the National Mall and Memorial Parks and at Independence National Historic Park in Philadelphia due to regulations and court cases specific to these areas. Because these two areas are long-standing venues for hundreds of First Amendment activities each year, we anticipated that there would be the potential for such activities during the shutdown. The National Park Service has maintained law enforcement services provided by the U.S. Park Police and Rangers for emergency and disaster assistance. We also have maintained our firefighting programs, border and coastal protection, and surveillance activities. Projects that were funded with non-lapsing appropriations have also continued. There has been a lot of attention on the monuments and memorials on the National Mall. They are among the many places that the National Park Service cares for that honor for those that have fought and died for our nation. We are proud of the special relationship we share with America's veterans, and we know that we will be here to protect these memorials now and for future generations. On a normal day, there are over 300 National Mall and Memorial Park employees on duty. The Rangers provide the eyes and ears of the U.S. Park Police. They enhance the visitor experience by sharing the history of the war, keeping the grounds and the restrooms clean, maintaining the landscape and fountains, and overseeing special events. All but a dozen of these 300 employees have been furloughed. Even though the U.S. Park Police commissioned officers have been accepted from the furlough, given the limited staff resources, prudent and practical steps were taken to secure the life and property of these national icons. We know that the visits to our World War II veterans to the memorials are pilgrimages, and many of them will make them only once. Throughout the shutdown, we have worked diligently to try to ensure that no honor flight group, veteran or their family, has been turned away from visiting the veterans' memorials. Likewise, those also engaging in First Amendment activities are welcome to visit the war memorials. Congress has charged the National Park Service with the preservation and protection of the park's natural, historic, and cultural resources for the benefit of future generations. This requirement in law exists whether the parks are open or shut down. With very few employees available, we are endeavoring to fulfill our mission the best we can. We look forward to the end of the shutdown so that we can reopen all of our national parks for the education, inspiration, and enjoyment of the American people. I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you. Ms. Simon.
Thank you, Chairman Issa, Chairman Hastings, Ranking Members Cummings and DeFazio, and members of the committees. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today on behalf of our members and the tourism industry. The National Tour Association membership includes 700 tour operators who package tours to, from, and within North America. They collectively move 10 million travelers annually and represent $6 billion in annual sales. 74% work domestically, and 36% are bringing international visitors into the United States. They serve both groups and individuals, travelers of all ages, and various special interest groups, and the majority of our members are small businesses. The balance of our 3,000 members are suppliers of travel components like hotels, attractions, restaurants, transportation companies, and destination marketers such as national, state, and local tourism organizations. Tour operators and their customers plan their trips 6 to 18 months in advance, so an abrupt shutdown of 401 park units cannot come without significant disruptions and costs. Since October 1, tour operators and their supplier partners have been scrambling to reroute itineraries and find alternative destinations and activities on a daily basis. NTA has had a long-standing relationship with the National Park Service, and they generally recognize the planning cycle needed in the package travel industry. Yet with this shutdown, neither NTA nor its tour operator members were advised about what park units would be closed during the shutdown. It's been difficult to locate information on what's closed, including roads through and around federal lands. In many cases, our members and their customers discovered closures upon arrival or had to send colleagues in advance to find out what the situation was. Our association and members incorrectly speculated that some of the units would remain open, particularly those that had no limited hours, no admission desks, no security checkpoints, and generally speaking, no specific point of entry. As a result, our tour operators have spent the last 2 weeks constantly dealing with a myriad of challenges and finding alternative activities and lodging. We surveyed our members 1 week into the shutdown, and 82% across the board reported an impact. Specifically, 85% of the tour operators reported rerouting and changing itineraries, 46% reported cancellations, and 57% reported having to refund deposits and fees. Initial estimates of the financial loss totaled $114 million just in the first week. Some of our members are also the suppliers and destinations that are dependent on the national parks in their areas, and they reported on an immediate decline in business, 91% reporting canceled or postponed tours, 56% in the first week were already seeing fewer visitors in their area. In addition to the immediate losses, the shutdown will have lasting effects on both the domestic travel industry and international visitation. The U.S. Travel Association estimates that we are losing $152 million a day. And the closure of the national parks is a big part of the reason that we've seen countries like the UK, Germany, and Australia have issued travel warnings for the United States. Another illustration is the burgeoning China market. NTA helps facilitate the MOU between the U.S. Department of Commerce and the China National Tourism Administration by certifying the U.S. tour operators who are able to handle that business from China. The beginning of October was Golden Week, which in China is a major vacation week. NTA tour operators reported not only disappointed customers but angry visitors who were unable to visit the national parks during their once-in-a-lifetime visit to the United States. Many of these inbound China operators were also not familiar with what was federal parks versus state parks, and thus had an even greater challenge finding information about their planned tours. We recognize that it's impossible to predict whether or not there will be a government shutdown, and that coordinating immediate closures of hundreds of parks is an enormous task. However, we recommend that there be a better plan that would avoid this situation in the future and enable the most significant park destinations, at a minimum, remain open, and that there be a communications plan that pushes out information to the travel trade and to the public. With today's technology capabilities, it should provide ample opportunities to better communicate what's happening. Tour operators depend on advanced planning, and we're seeing the consequences of the disruption caused by these closures with no specific notice. Thank you for allowing me to testify today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Ebel.
Chairman Issa and Chairman Hastings, thank you for inviting me to testify here today at this important hearing on the way the National Park Service is implementing the federal shutdown. My name is Myron Ebell, and I'm Director of the Center for Energy and Environment at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, a group that has been already recognized here today. CEI is a nonprofit and nonpartisan free market public policy institute that specializes in regulations. A large part of our work is devoted to environmental issues, including management of the federal lands by the 4 federal land agencies. 20 years ago, I spent 4 or 5 years as the Washington representative of the American Land Rights Association, which was started in 1978 by Chuck Cushman as the National Park Inholders Association. So I have some firsthand experience of these issues. Later, I worked for a former member of the Natural Resources Committee from Arizona and dealt with a wide array of federal lands issues, including all the national park problems in Arizona. Now, clearly, a federal shutdown is going to cause many federal facilities to have to close, including parks. Director Jarvis explained how rational and well thought out their program for doing that was. But that isn't the issue. The issue is all of these petty, malicious acts. How can you close down a parking lot at Mount Vernon that you lease to the Mount Vernon Ladies Association and have nothing to do with? You're spending extra money to come and close it down. Does that comply with the Anti-Deficiency Act? To close down Glen Echo Park along the Clara Barton Parkway, which is funded and operated by Montgomery County. To close the Claude Moore Colonial Farm, as Anna Eberly has explained. To close Lanley Fork Sports Park in Fairfax County, which is leased to Fairfax County and operated and maintained by them. To take cones and barricades and close off turnoffs on state highways so people can't stop to take photos and look at Mount Rushmore. Where does the personnel and the money for that come from? These are questions that I think need to be answered. Now, I think that the publicity for some of these small-minded and almost unbelievably low actions by the National Park Service the public is starting to notice those, and I think they are figuring out an important point, and this is really what I want to concentrate on. Americans love their national parks, and the National Park Service has spent decades hiding behind that affection that Americans rightly have for those great natural wonders and historic sites. The National Park Service, for anybody who has followed its history, is a terrible steward of many of its parks, of the environmental conditions in those parks. They are also not visitor-friendly in many cases. They are not people-friendly. They are not good neighbors. They mistreat their inholders, and they act like they own everything and that everybody else can just lump it. So I hope that this starts a process, this public awareness, this opening to understanding that the National Park Service is not the same as our great national parks, to investigate the problems in the National Park Service and to initiate much-needed reforms. I was somewhat, my anger about what's been going on was somewhat relieved by this weekend when the veterans went to the World War II Memorial and picked up the barricades and put them in front of the White House. As President Obama often says, we're Americans, we can do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Galvin.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Dennis Galvin. Today I represent the National Parks and Conservation Association. It's 800,000 members and supporters. NPCA has advocated support for our national park system since 1919. Perhaps more pertinent to today's hearing is the nearly 40 years I spent with the National Park Service, the last 16 years in Washington. 9 of those were as Deputy Director. I held that post under Presidents Reagan, Clinton, and Bush. I am informed that there have been 17 shutdowns since 1976, ranging from 1 to 21 days. During my tenure, there were 5, including the long shutdown, 21 days of 1995-96. I have been struck by the similarities between that 1995-96 event and today's. Let me say a little bit about preparing shutdown plans. They are, by force of circumstance, hastily prepared by people who hope that they will not have to be used. For a highly decentralized agency like the National Park Service, which literally stretches across the international date line, and today comprises 401 units, it simply is not possible to cover every eventuality. Because most closures have not been more than a few days, their shortcomings don't surface. But as closures lengthen, questions arise due to circumstances unforeseen or difficult to predict. Nevertheless, the trajectory of this closure parallels 95-96 to a remarkable degree. Did we barricade monuments and memorials then? Yes. Lincoln and Jefferson were barricaded. It was at the holiday season, so we had the Festival of Lights going on the Ellipse. That was closed, and a chain-link fence was put around it. The much-discussed World War II memorial did not exist then, but if it had, I think we would have barricaded it. Were state and local economies devastated? Yes. The counties around Yosemite petitioned for disaster assistance. Grand Canyon and Mount Rushmore were flashpoints. Governor Symington threatened to send the National Guard to Grand Canyon. It is not true that Grand Canyon was opened without conflict in 95-96. I negotiated many of the agreements that we reached in 95-96. And one thing I'll say about the unintended consequences of a shutdown, there were only 2 lawyers to work with in the Interior Building to negotiate those agreements. So that it's more than just there aren't any Park Service employees around, there aren't any support employees around either. And when it all concluded, it had been a very bad idea. So bad that 17 years has elapsed before it happened again. It is worth asking why parks moved to the center of the closure discussion. They are a minuscule and declining part of the Federal budget, 1/15 of 1% of Federal expenditures. In 1981, by the way, they were 1/8 of 1%. So we spend about 50% of what we spend in terms of proportions on our national parks. But they are an easily accessible symbol. Closure may be hard to understand in less visible agencies, but a closed campground, a child crying because she can't visit the Statue of Liberty become convenient and graphic metaphors of a much larger failure. As we discuss the parks today, our other public lands are inaccessible to varying degrees. Agencies such as the Veterans Administration, CDC, the Public Health Service, National Institute of Health, NASA work with skeleton staffs. They too deserve attention and support. It is time to reopen the government and get back to doing the nation's business. The parks have been in the spotlight during the closure, and we hope they remain there when they reopen. The sequester has already resulted in curtailment of services. The reductions are the equivalent of about 7,000 seasonal employees or 1,750 permanents. This comes on top of the long-range decline in park funding. Some years ago, I made a presentation that traced the national park idea back to the founding documents of this country. In the Constitution, it is found in the preamble, to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Open the government, open the parks, let park rangers go back to doing the work they love, and let the rest of us enjoy again America's best idea. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And although it would seem irresistible to ask Director Jarvis first, whose land is it? Is it the government's or is it the American people's in your mind? I'm going to waive my going first and recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Gov't, to ask the first round of questions.
Mr. Chairman.
That is perfect. Please restart the clock. Thank you. Some is recognized.
Some may disagree with that. I want to thank the gentleman from North Carolina for giving me his microphone. Mr. Jarvis, in October of 2011, Occupy protesters descended upon McPherson Square, and they decided to stay. Despite the clear language of the law, these protesters camped at McPherson Square with the definition of camping being sleeping or preparing to sleep for 100 days. They camped in violation of the law, and you did not make a single solitary arrest for camping. So Congress decided to have a hearing and ask you why you were not enforcing the law. And you told us, Mr. Jarvis, that you had a great deal of discretion in how and when to enforce the law. You told us that you were, after 100 days of not enforcing the plain language of the statute, working with protesters to, quote, gain compliance, whatever the hell that means, with the law, and what you called, quote, a measured and reasoned approach. By the way, Mr. Jarvis, those were your words, not mine. So the law says no camping, but the protesters camped anyway, and you didn't do anything in terms of arrest or citations for over 100 days. So, Mr. Jarvis, I want you to fast forward 2 years. Parks are closing. Access to monuments is restricted, even access for those who helped build the monument in the first place. You didn't wait 100 days to enforce the law, Mr. Jarvis, with veterans who wanted to see their monument. You didn't work to gain compliance. Veterans weren't greeted with a measured and reasoned response, Mr. Jarvis. They were greeted with barricades on the very first day. Furthermore, they could not exercise their First Amendment rights to walk to a monument that they helped build, but yet some of our colleagues were allowed to exercise their First Amendment right to protest whatever it was they were protesting on the National Mall. So I'm going to read something to you, Mr. Jarvis. And I want you to ask me if you recognize who said this. Because of the lapse in funding, you are having to deliver difficult news to our visitors and partners. The functions we must perform under a shutdown are not the reasons any of us join the National Park Service, but they are the duties we are required to perform by law and regulation. Do you know who said that, Mr. Jarvis?
I believe I said that.
You're right, you did. So can you tell me why you would not enforce the law at McPherson Square, but yet you greeted veterans with barricades on the very first day? What regulation can you cite to me that required you by law to erect barricades?
The contingency plan that was approved on September 27th for the National Park System is in compliance with the Anti-Deficiency Act.
I'm looking for a statute, Mr. Jarvis. I am looking for a citation to the Code of Federal Regulation or the U.S. Code for why you erected barricades. We've established you did not enforce the law for 100 days for protesters. Agreed? You agree with me? You did not issue a single citation for camping, right?
I believe that is correct.
Either it is or it isn't. Is it? Not one single citation for camping.
I do not remember exactly.
Well, your previous testimony was that you had not issued a single citation for camping despite 100 days of noncompliance.
That was 2 years ago.
Okay. Well, I can cite you the regulation that you did not follow 2 years ago. Can you cite me the regulation that required you to erect barricades to prevent veterans from accessing a monument that they built?
I can cite the Anti-Deficiency Act.
Can you cite a regulation that required you to erect barricades, Mr. Jarvis? That is not a complex question.
The Anti-Deficiency Act requires that I reduce all employees down to only those that are necessary for life and property. That required the closure of all 401 national parks.
Mr. Jarvis, why did you fail to enforce the plain language of a statute for 100 days for protesters. And yet, on the very first day, you denied access to a monument that veterans helped build.
On the very first day of the closure, I implemented a closure order for all 401 national parks in compliance with the Anti-Deficiency Act, and immediately that day, also included as a part of that order that First Amendment activities would be permitted on the National Mall.
Do you consider it First Amendment activity to walk to a monument that you helped build, or is it only just smoking pot at McPherson Square?
The First Amendment activities, we are content neutral on First Amendment on the National Mall.
That wasn't my question. Do you consider it to be an exercise of your First Amendment right to a walk to a monument that you helped build?
If an individual declares they are there for to exercise their First Amendment
activities, who were they to declare it to?
The gentleman's time has expired.
Could I ask the final question? Who were they to declare it to?
To
a barricade?
on the site. On the National Mall, any group under 25 does not need a permit to exercise their First Amendment. And we set up the policy to allow our veterans in, including all of the honor flights under First Amendment. So they were not denied access.
Mr. Chairman, I want the record to reflect that no statute or code of the federal regulation was cited to justify the erection of a barricade.
The record will indicate that. Director Jarvis, in pursuant to his question, Ms. Eberly looked like she wanted an answer to what statute provided for her to be closed. Would you please address your answer to her? If it's anti-deficiency, go ahead and say it to her.
It's anti-deficiency. We, in the case of the Claude Moore Farm, along with many similar situations, we had to actually investigate whether or not we were providing direct services that would be in violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act. Utilities, trash pickup, any of the things that are not related to life and property. In the case of the Claude Moore Farm, we have been providing funding to them in the tune of $100,000 a year, every year. So we were not going to give it in 2014, and Ms. Eberly knows that, and that's a concern for both of us, that because of our decline in funding. So I had to make a determination whether or not I was going to be in violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act, which I cannot violate. It is a law passed by this body that I cannot violate. There are criminal penalties to my agency to violate that law. So as we shut down, immediately we began to work towards figuring out how to get a workaround that would allow Claude Moore, Pisgah Inn, a whole variety of these partnership facilities open. And we've opened over a dozen or more already because we've determined that there is no violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act.
Okay. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the fact that you discovered you were wrong on day one. I now ask unanimous consent that this historic news archive from the 1996 period be placed in the record, in which it says, in real time in 1995, December 16, 1995, tourists were free to wander the halls of the Capitol, touch the walls of the Vietnam Memorial, and climb the steps of the Lincoln Memorial to read the Gettysburg Address. Without objection, so ordered. Additionally, I now ask that your document from the United States Department of Interior, which is your declaration, National Park Service closure determination and notice, be placed in the record, in which, in line 7, it says, the closure determination and notice does not apply to private owners of interest in real property located within the exterior boundaries and units of the National Park Service, etc. And line 8, which says the closure determination and notice does not apply to roads that pass through units of the National Park systems and provide access. Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Director Jarvis, let me ask you this. How many employees does the Park Service have?
About 24,000.
And you had to furlough how many?
21,328.
And what percentage is that of the employees? About 87%?
Yeah, somewhere in that neighborhood, 80%, 88, 85%.
And so those folks, they were it was basically mandated that they couldn't come to work. Is that right, pretty much?
That's correct.
Now, what impact did that have on your decisions and what you did with regard to this, the matter that Mr. Gov't was just asking you about?
The monuments and memorials on the National Mall do not take care of themselves. Every day, I have employees there that clean the restrooms, clean up the messes behind the public, pick up trash, ensure that the elevators are available for those that need to access the chambers of the Jefferson or the Lincoln. They provide the eyes and the ears for the U.S. Park Police, who are not duty stationed to stand and watch over monuments. They are there to respond. U.S. Park Police responded to the incident at the Navy Yard. They responded to the incident with the Capitol Police recently. They are a response agency. And our rangers are there to prevent vandalism and impact to the monuments and memorials. All of those rangers have been furloughed. So the consequences are that as much as there's a lot of talk about open-air monuments and memorials that are unmanned, they are not unoccupied. My responsibility is to ensure that they are protected 24 hours a day, and not just with somebody that might come in a late response. We have staff that are there, and all of those. So out of 300 that would normally be on the mall, I have 12.
So therefore, there are consequences, as Mr. Connolly says, to all of this. Is that right? In other words, when you've got to furlough people, you're going to have some consequences.
Yes, sir.
And so you cannot cover everything you'd like to cover. Is that right?
I cannot protect these monuments and memorials to the standard that this country expects me to do so.
Now, one of the things that you said, going back to the hearing that Mr. Gov't was talking about, that impressed me quite a bit, is you talked about how important it is to you personally, and you said it again today, that when people come to visit our parks, our monuments, that you took it as a personal type of thing, that you wanted them to be able to enjoy that it was very significant, that it was just as significant to you, if you would want the same thing for your family that you want for them. Do you still feel that way?
Yes, sir. If I may, in 2016, the National Park Service will be 100 years old, and I will have worked for this agency for 40 of those years. I have been a law enforcement ranger. I have been search and rescue, firefighter, superintendent, regional director, and now director under many presidents, many secretaries of the Interior. And I think I represent the agency of public servants that are dedicated to providing these places to the American public. It pains us to not be able to invite the American public into their national parks. This is as painful for the employees that take great pride in providing these 401 places for the enjoyment of the American people.
Somebody on the other side said a little bit earlier, folks are treated badly at the parks. And I got to say, even before I became a congressman and people did not know me in these parks, I've never had a bad experience with regard to employees. And I want to say to the employees that are watching us right now that we thank you for your service. We thank you for dedicating your lives to making life better and bringing life to life for so many people. Now, let me ask you something else. I already talked about some of the impacts the shutdown is having on veterans. I asked unanimous consent to insert in the hearing record a letter the Military Officers Association of America sent to me yesterday. This letter states in part, and I quote, "Veterans and their families, too, are experiencing reductions in certain services. Even though VA health care continues uninterrupted under the advanced appropriations, other services have been suspended or severely cut back, including veteran outreach programs, counseling for wounded warriors, and student vets on campus, among others," end of quote.
Without objection, that will be part of the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would also like to insert into the record a written statement from the Student Veterans of America. This statement says, and I quote, "The current government shutdown has created an overwhelming sense of uncertainty for students, veterans. With the Department of Veterans Affairs resources like the GI Bill hotline unavailable, many veterans are wondering whether or not they'll be able to pay next month's rent or even have GI Bill benefits to remain enrolled in school," end of quote.
That will be part of the record also without objection. Time of the gentleman has expired.
Let me say this, Mr. In our committee, what we had just now was a total between Mr. Gov't and Mr. Issa, a total of 9 minutes. I'd like the unanimous.
In my committee, we go the 5-minute route, but I'll give the gentleman a leeway.
Thank you very much. I don't have much more, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your courtesy. I also would like to insert in the record a letter from the Reserve Officers Association of the United States of America. The impact on veterans is just one example of the toll the shutdown is taking on Americans. As a result of the shutdown, 7 Head Start programs were forced to close, leaving 7,000 preschool children locked out of the classroom and their parents scrambling to find child care. A private donation has helped bridge the funding gap, but Head Start programs across the country are facing closures if the shutdown continues. The National Transportation Safety Board has suspended an investigation of a train derailment in Baltimore County, Maryland, as well as train derailment in Ellicott City, Maryland, that resulted in the release of 20,000 gallons of vinyl chloride. I could go on and on with specific examples such as these, but let's talk about the impact of the Republicans' governing tactics on the economy. The Peterson Foundation released a report this week titled, quote, "The Cost of the Crisis-Driven Fiscal Policy," end of quote. The report finds that the arbitrary and short-sighted approach to governing by crisis is hurting the economy. The report concludes that these policies have, quote, "saddled a still struggling economy with the fiscal drag of a contraction of discretionary spending, created general uncertainty about fiscal policy that, though its impact on financial markets has undermined economic growth, and finally forced the first prolonged shutdown of the federal government since the first term of the Clinton administration, and failed to raise the federal debt ceiling in a timely manner, conjuring the specter of a sovereign default with all its financial and economic fallout. The report finds that the result is that the growth of gross domestic product has slowed by as much as, I'm wrapping up right now, Mr. Chairman, just taking the same thing that Mr. Issa did. The report finds that the result is that the growth of the gross domestic product has slowed by as much as 1 percentage point since 2010. Director Jarvis, you are responsible for running an agency that is charged with protecting our national parks, which contribute to the national economy, and we thank you for your service. With that, I yield back.
I don't have to remind the gentleman that his time had expired 2.5 minutes ago, but I just want to, I'll recognize myself, and I'm going to try to adhere to the 5 minutes. When you have government shutdowns, there's obviously going to be some displacement. That happens. But let's understand that these are decisions that the political class has difficulty sometimes reconciling. Our founders devised a system that was supposed to be hard. Government of the people is hard. If you want efficiency, then you go to a dictatorship. But if you want to have freedom and liberty, you have our form of government. And so now we're caught in this situation right now, and we have to do our best to get through that. Ms. Everly made an observation in her response about, I don't know who's responsible, but we ought to find out. That struck me and reminded me of the saying that a government that is big enough to give you something is big enough to take it away. Now, what's frightening about what we're going through right now, we have had 17 shutdowns since 1980, I believe is what the figure is. But this is the first time that access has been denied to open air malls, open air monuments. Now, that frankly should be a little bit frightening, it seems to me, that if a government will go to that much effort to make it difficult for the American people to see their national treasures, that ought to be a red flag for everybody. I think that's what this hearing is all about. Now, what I would like to I'd like to ask Director Jarvis, and thank you for being here. You and I spoke briefly beforehand, and you said you've had better weeks. I suppose we've all had better weeks at some time. But I want to refer to the issue of the First Amendment activities, because the First Amendment is a constitutional activity. We all know that. In your directive on number 9, you canceled all previously issued permits with the exception of those here in National Mall, and you put that out, National Mall, I think the White House in Philadelphia, and so forth. But what got America's attention was when the World War I vets could not access, or World War II vets could not access, their monument because of those barricades that's been well documented. So my question: were there permits? Were there permits not acknowledged, or what happened with the honor flights?
Prior to the shutdown, the honor flights were not a permitted
Okay,
activity.
so they were not permitted.
No.
Okay, but now you change course and said, okay, these honor flights can have First Amendment rights. And World War II Mall. But I thought I heard you say in testimony that others less than a size of 25 don't have those same rights. Did I hear you correctly?
No, that the regulations for the National Mall, because we host about 600 First Amendment activities here each year, if it's a group under 25, they can exercise their First Amendment activities without a permit.
Okay, but all right. So that's the interesting part then. You had barricades for World War II veterans. Obviously, they're over 25, but individuals. Somebody from, say, my hometown came here. They would be denied access, and yet you said they're exempt. I see an inconsistency in here how this is applied.
No, if your friends came and walked up to the ranger and said, I'm exercising my First Amendment activities and I have a group under 25, then they could do that.
Well, see, now, in due respect, now I'm going to have to pursue this. You have an agency within the Park Service that defines what First Amendment rights are, and people have to go up and outwardly ask to have their First Amendment rights exercised by an okay from the Park Service. Is that what I'm hearing?
There has been many, many cases of First Amendment litigation.
That's my question.
So there is a body of law. I'm sorry, but there is a body of law associated with First Amendment activities on the mall. Let me give you, for instance, the chamber of the Lincoln Memorial is not available for First Amendment activities. So that's in statute or in regulation, nor is the chamber of the Jefferson. But the plaza is. And in the case of the World War II Memorial, the entire World War II Memorial is open to First Amendment activities. So,
except in this case when the barricades were put up because of well, I don't know. Maybe we'll really find out where that came from. Let me, a last question. I'm over time, and I try not to do that. I really try to adhere to that in my committee. I guess the obvious question is all of this decision that was made regarding restricting activity, was that your decision?
Yes, sir, it was.
Totally your decision?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. I want to recognize now Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I regret the committee chairman from INO isn't here at the moment, but this is a photograph from the '95 shutdown. And that is the Lincoln Memorial, and the closure begins at the base of the steps. People were not allowed to go into the Lincoln Memorial. You know, I would say that we got a lot more loose tools running around this country doing destructive things now than we did in '95. We had someone attack the monument recently, so to say, gee, we shouldn't need any staff there to protect these memorials is absurd in this day and age. So I also have a letter here I'd like to enter into the record from the National Park Ranger Lodge of the Fraternal Order of Police. And I'll quote just two things from this letter. Without any contrary court findings or changes in the law, despite what the gentleman on the other side said, we will carry on with this miserable, thankless, and payless task, denying public access to parks during the government shutdown. You know, although our actions make sensational news stories and fodder for the pundits, they are supported by precedent, legal guidance from government lawyers under laws we are sworn to enforce. You know, the Park Service Rangers want to be working. They want to be regularly admitting people to memorials and parks and then guarding those people and the memorials and the parks against destructive activities. But because of the Republican government shutdown, they cannot do that. Plain and simple. You can't create something and then pretend you're outraged by the results, which is what I'm hearing from the other side of the aisle. Director Jarvis, I do have a question. They seem to love our parks today, but I haven't seen that love much recently since the Republicans took over Congress 2010. 2010, your total budget was $2,750,000,000. In 2013, $2,400,000,000, which would be less than the 2008 spending levels. Since 2008, have you caught up on your capital backlog?
No, sir. Our maintenance backlog now exceeds $11 billion.
$11 billion maintenance backlog on these parks, which are now loved so much by the other side of the aisle. Well, given the reduction in spending and taking you back to 2008, have you had to cut back earlier this year before the closures?
Yes, sir. Particularly with the sequestration, we had to cut back significantly on both program and hours. We are currently have 1,000 for this last summer, 1,000 less seasonals, and we have 900 positions that are permanent positions that are unfilled.
Okay, 1,000 less seasonals, 900 less permanent, and the Republicans are saying the sequestration, which they created, which has cut your budget back to below 2008 year levels, is politically motivated, the things you're doing there. Is it politically motivated when you noticed those people that, they weren't going to be working this summer?
No, sir. There's no politics involved here. This is just our responsibility to take care of the national parks with what resources we have.
I thank the gentleman. I'd note further, there are some other perverse impacts on our federal lands. Wildlife refuges are closed, and those on the other side of the aisle who day in, day out are there to defend the Second Amendment aren't doing much to defend those who want to hunt on those lands during this hunting season and the losses that are being caused there. They aren't doing anything by keeping the government closed to help those in rural areas who want to work. I got timber industry folks who've been noticed that their contracts are going to be suspended. Now, they're going to have a right to sue the government and get money back for suspending their contracts. Unfortunately, we won't have those logs this winter to tie the mills over to the spring in areas where you can't get into the mountains in the wintertime. And yet, that's because of the government shutdown. They might say, oh, well, they should just let them go forward. Well, they can't let them go forward because they have a fiduciary responsibility to monitor the timber sale. There have been instances where people cut trees they weren't supposed to cut. They've gone beyond the boundaries of the cut. Timber theft, it's called. Those things happen. The government needs to have officials there to monitor this. They can't do it under your shutdown. We're losing money. We're losing jobs. Now you pretend you care about rural America. You care about our parks, which you've slashed the budget for. This is absolutely the height of hypocrisy, the fact that we're here today trying to figure out why the parks are closed because of a government shutdown and what bizarre things have happened because
Mr. Chairman, I would like to make an inquiry for a point of personal privilege.
The gentleman I think he's probably asking for a parliamentary inquiry, so I'll recognize him for that.
When the gentleman says that you pretend that you care about the parks, are you speaking about anybody on this dais so that I will know whether to have the gentleman's words taken down or not?
Any member has the right to ask another member's words to be taken down. But I think what this discussion is here, the gentleman was addressing it in the proper way that we address those sort of things in the third person, and so I didn't intervene. He obviously
I heard the second person, Mr. Chairman.
He obviously has strong feelings like members on both sides of the aisle have on that.
I heard second person instead of third person, which is not proper.
I did not hear a second person. Time of the gentleman has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Micah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I think it's important that we conduct this oversight hearing in a joint fashion. I think that of all the things that's happened, and nobody favors a shutdown, Republicans or Democrats. Our side believes that we're we're on the verge of a permanent shutdown of our government, which would be much worse when you spend so much money and incur so much indebtedness that we lose our financial credibility, our national security as a result of that. So this is a legitimate debate. There have been more than a dozen shutdowns. There have been, I just heard today, I never realized that under Carter we actually went beyond the debt limit. Not that we want to follow that model. The problem here is that it appears that what took place by the Park Service was offensive to the American people, to the Congress, and to just the concept of common sense, Director Jarvis. That's what this is about. I mean, I think nothing has resonated more with the public than to see an open-air monument such as the World War II Memorial and close by the Martin Luther King Memorial. It just seems that common sense did not prevail. Now you said you take full responsibility for that action. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And did you discuss this with the Secretary of Interior, Jewel, at any time?
Yes, I did.
And then you didn't discuss it with anyone in the White House, did you?
In several times on the phone with the White House, I presented with the Secretary my decision, but it was never the reverse. There was never any decision coming down.
So you discussed with officials in the White House your action, and you also discussed it with her. Now, the common belief among even Park Service employees, and I quote one of them, who's this is a press account, October 3rd, "It's a cheap way to deal with the situation," an angry Park Service ranger in Washington says of the harassment. "We've been told to make life as difficult as we can. It's disgusting." This is the common belief of people who work for you, and he believes he was told to make this as difficult and as painful as possible. How would you respond to that?
I have no idea where that information came from.
It's a park ranger quoted from a news.
That's hearsay. What I'm telling you is that—
It may be hearsay, sir, and
but I am in communication with my employees, the ones that are still on work, and they do not believe that.
Well,
so to say that this is the belief of the National Park Service employees, that's incorrect.
Okay, well, here's one, and I can tell you I am in contact with my constituents as an elected representative, and nothing has appalled the American people more than I've seen in my 2 decades of service than what you've done. To close an open-air monument like the World War II or across the street, across the way, where people could walk. Now, granted, that was not in existence in '95. Maybe you didn't have a precedent. But it was offensive to close a place where you could walk. You said your job is to protect the monuments. How would the monuments not be protected if people walk there?
They are protected if we don't
the
have
monuments. Now, the people are protected by the park police and the district police, and I'm told that, and we have evidence that there are almost as many to protect the people.
That's incorrect.
Yes.
If I may correct the record here, the U.S. Park Police has been accepted from furlough. The U.S. Park Police are in New York, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C. They have responsibilities for the George Washington Memorial Parkway, for traffic, for the regular commuting in here every day.
But I'm told in the District of Columbia, extraordinary measures are available to make certain that, again, that our monuments, the streets, we've had a horrible incident that took place. They were on the job protecting the people. But your job is to protect the monuments. Now, you talked to folks in the White House. Who did you talk to in the White House?
I actually do not know who was on the phone. I do not. It was only informing.
Did they relate to you that you should continue to inflict pain?
They did not.
All right. And can you provide to the committee that information of who you spoke to and when on this matter?
We are retaining all of our records as requested by the committee chairman, and once we get out of the shutdown, we'll be providing those.
Well, we'll subpoena them or get them one way or the other. Thank you. I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired, and I appreciate the director saying he's going to comply with our request that we sent on October 2nd. Gentleman from American Samoa, Mr. Faleomavega.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly want to welcome our witnesses and for the testimonies that they've provided before the joint hearing this morning. Mr. Jarvis, I want to commend you for the distinction and the outstanding job that you have done or is doing as the Director of the National Park Service. With a track record of some 40 years of service to our nation, to the American people, I think should be recognized. Mr. Jarvis, you mentioned that the Park Service takes in about 232 million visitors a year, with some 700,000 people each day of the 401 national parks, and you have to operate in the budget as 1/15 of 1% of our national budget. Am I correct in putting these before you?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
Mr. Jarvis, it's sad that I seem to see that you have become a political punching bag for this hearing, and it's really unfortunate. And I think what we're trying to do here is to give a real sense of the challenges and the problems that you're faced with as the director. When you were given notice that you need to shut down, you mentioned that the shutdown occurred on the 1st of October?
That is correct.
And how do you go about shutting down an agency? I believe 70,000 federal workers work for the Department of the Interior, and out of that, some 68,000 have been furloughed?
Somewhere in that neighborhood, yes.
And the Park Service is part of that?
That's correct.
In all the responsibilities that you bear, and I think it's been a common interest explained here this morning, the fact that a tremendous economic disaster has been created because of the shutdown. Am I correct on that?
We calculate that for every dollar invested in the national park system, you get $10 back to the economy.
And Mr. Galvin, I am very interested in your statement. You said you represent the National Parks Conservation Association with a membership of some 800,000 of our fellow Americans?
That's correct, Mr. Faleomavega.
What are some of the most classic things that the association has been able to achieve, and you as a trustee of this association?
Well, as I said in my opening statement, the National Parks Conservation Association is uniquely focused on supporting the national parks since 1919. And we do that by providing information to the public, by providing information to our visitors, by involving ourselves in issues at the park level, by
Mr. Galvin, my time is short. Let me go on. I want to send you. I'd like to quote your statement that you made here as an observation on the hearing this morning, and I quote, "The National Park Service is not to blame for the failure of Congress to keep our government open and provide the resources needed to maintain our parks and keep them completely open. Blaming national parks employees for the abysmal results of such a failure of national leadership is unconscionable." Can you share that with us more?
Well, you know, I think this hearing is about how the shutdown has worked out, okay? And as I said in my statement, doing shutdown plans isn't easy for a 401-unit system that extends beyond the international date line. But there isn't any question about why there was a shutdown. There is no appropriation. There is no continuing resolution. There is no money to pay employees. Even the few employees that John has at his disposal today are not being paid. So we can debate about the World War II Memorial or Grand Canyon. The fact is 401 units of the National Park Service are mostly closed.
Mr. Jarvis, I'm sorry, my time is getting, thank you, Mr. Galvin. Mr. Jarvis, how much of an economic benefit, what has it done to the economy of this country, the fact that what the national parks has done in terms of, just like Mayor Bryan, Ms. Eberly, and Ms. Simon, in terms of their responsibilities, how much this of an economic impact because of the closure?
Well, at this moment, October, which is a peak period for many of our gateway communities, the impact is enormous. And, you know, they're not going to recover that. I mean, even if the federal employees are paid at the end of this, our concessioners, our gateway communities, those hotels, restaurants will not recover this loss. And so we have already begun to figure out how we can get some of these back open. And as the mayor of Tusayan indicated, we've reopened the Grand Canyon, we've reopened Rocky Mountain, 8 parks in Utah, all of these because, you know, frankly, we shut these down on October 1 and immediately began to figure out how we can work to get those back open without violating the Anti-Deficiency Act. And I think the evidence shows, from Claude Moore to the Peaks of Otter to the Grand Canyon, that I have been working very hard with a very small staff. There are only 9 of us left in the Park Service in Washington office to get these parks back open so that we can get the $76 million per day that the National Park Service is contributing to the national economy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Time the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Utah, Mr. Bishop.
Mr. Jarvis, you said you have about 3,000 exempt employees. I'm assuming those are all security personnel?
There are
the numbers.
I've got the numbers.
The number's not important. Are those security personnel?
Not all of them.
Most of them?
Most of them.
Do you have roughly the same number of security personnel in the mall as you had before the shutdown?
Yes.
Okay. Is there a specific threat to the property or life of anything that is taking place on the mall that is different now than before the shutdown?
Our intelligence indicate that there has been an uptick in activity and interest during the shutdown in potential threats.
Can you give me a specific one?
I cannot give you the specifics.
Is putting barricades up a normal practice after the interpreters and the maintenance service have left those particular areas?
No.
If there is no greater threat, if there is no specific threat, and you actually put up barricades on those monuments, you have violated the Anti-Deficiency Act. You have created a new obligation with no new threat. If there is not a specific threat, you have violated the Anti-Deficiency Act. Now, Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I'd like to yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Bishop. And I represent some of the nation's greatest national parks. I represent the 2nd District in Utah. We have Zions, we have Bryce Canyon, many others. To the American people, and particularly to some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I would like to make what I think is a very obvious point. It's entirely the point of this hearing. Yeah, the government's in a partial shutdown, and there are implications that come from that. The question to consider is this. In the midst of a crisis, should the federal government choose to make things better, or should they choose to make things worse? Should the administration seek to alleviate some of this inconvenience and some of this pain, or should they seek to exaggerate those? Should the federal government be viewed as a friend to the people or as an enemy? And Mr. Jarvis, surely you must realize that because of some of your actions, many Americans view you not as an advocate, but as an adversary. And I think, you know, we're in a political conflict right now, and we'll move on. We always do. We find a way to move through this, and 6 months from now, the American people will move on with their lives. A year from now or 5 years from now, some of this will be forgotten, but I think that the lasting impression that most Americans will have will be of those veterans standing at the World War II Memorial and being denied access to that. And so, Mr. Jarvis, let me ask you, if I could, you are not here voluntarily, is that right?
I volunteered to come after the shutdown when I would have staff to prepare.
Are you here because of the force of a subpoena?
I am.
Okay, that would seem to be not voluntarily then. If you view your actions as defensible, then why didn't you volunteer to come and sit before this committee and answer questions?
I did volunteer to come, but not on this date. I don't have any staff to prepare. Normally, I would have a staff that would work on developing testimony.
You said before these
furloughed.
You said before these were your decisions. I wouldn't imagine you would need staff to explain to you why you made the decisions that you claimed you have made.
I don't need staff to explain to me, but I do need staff to prepare testimony because this committee requires testimony to be submitted in advance, and those staff are furloughed.
Would the gentleman suspend?
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, a point of not inquiry, but parliamentary clarification.
Parliamentary clarification, or actually it's inquiry would be a better one, but the gentleman is recognized for that.
When we subpoenaed the director, our staff had already made it clear, and I believe the director is aware, that essential personnel under the Act would include such personnel as are necessary to respond to Congress. And that was the basis under which we subpoenaed him, because waiting till afterwards simply meant that he was unwilling to return such personnel as were necessary to prepare for today's hearing. And I just wanted to make that point, that there was a dialogue in preparation to make the determination that he could bring back on a daily basis such personnel as were necessary if he wanted to be better prepared for today's hearing.
That's my understanding. Also, the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Stewart, is recognized for the balance of the time.
Well, thank you both to the chairman, and I think it emphasizes my point that if we considered these decisions and actions as being defensible, you would not be reluctant, and I would think you would be anxious to come before the committees and to defend those decisions. In the few seconds I have left, let me make this point if I could. My state has worked in agreement with Secretary Jewell to reopen the national parks within Utah. And I'm wondering, Director, do you support that decision to work in concert with state governors and others to open these parks?
Absolutely.
Would you support, expecting that we may find ourselves in this situation again, maybe in a year, maybe in 20 years, but at some point we may find ourselves in a government shutdown again. Would you support my efforts to have agreements in place that would immediately open up these parks with the support of the states so that we don't find ourselves in this situation again?
We've talked about this in that we really have set a new bar here by entering into these agreements, very simple agreements, frankly, with Colorado, New York, South Dakota, Utah. And so we have sort of started the new point that if we go into a shutdown, we now have the template, fairly easy to do this. Now, I want to mention two things, though. We did set a standard, and we worked it out with your governor and the other governors. One is that the National Park Service would run these parks and that the states would pay for the National Park Service to operate them. This is the professional staff that had been doing this, and we could open them instantly using our employees. It was not, I would not support the states themselves taking over the national parks. But entering into an agreement like this, and that it pays for the entire park operation, not just cherry-picking components of parks, I would support putting this into policy so that we can execute on it very quickly.
Okay, thank you.
Time the gentleman has expired. I would just note that there probably was a template after the 95-96 too that probably should have been followed. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Norton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I could not identify more with our witnesses on the effect of the shutdown on your local economies. And I think every red-blooded American would similarly identify with the outrage of the residents of your host city, the nation's capital, who in addition have seen the shutdown not only of our tourist economy as you have, but Congress is holding $6 billion, that's more than 4 states, collect of local funds, not one penny of it federal funds. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the Republicans and Democrats who voted with us to free the district's local funds. We're finally making some headway with the Senate and the administration. Mr. Jarvis, sitting here in the District of Columbia as a third-generation Washingtonian, I cannot bear to hear the employees of the Park Service maligned. Yeah, we have trouble with our civil servants, but I want to say for the record that how unfair I think it is for the Republicans to shut down the government and then blame the National Park Service. I thank you for the way in which you protect our monuments and the people who visit our monuments. Some of us are still recalling when green paint was splattered on the Lincoln Memorial, even though there was no shutdown because of the difficulty of guarding the memorials. In 2007, I remember there was a horrific incident, vandalism as well, on the Vietnam Memorial. Is it true that there are about 2,000 cases of vandalism every day on the memorials of our country throughout the United States?
That's correct.
I also can't bear the way in which our veterans have been made poster children by my Republican friends, making them look as if they are victims. My own paper, the Washington Post, carries an article this morning about a coalition of 33 veterans organizations, the American Legion, all of them. Of course, they came to complain about the cutoff of their own benefits. But let me read you what they said. The executive director of the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America put the country first and end this shutdown. That's veterans. That's how they talk, not let us out, and maybe the rest of you will get out too. They go back for everybody who is victimized. Here's another of the speakers. Several speakers said they oppose measures that would restore funding to VA, but not to some other parts of the government. Quote, fixing a little by little is not going to resolve this problem for veterans. And that was the director of the Veterans of Foreign Wars. In contrast to some demonstrations over the 2-week shutdown, including a protest Sunday, during which demonstrators pulled down barriers, Tuesday's rally was peaceful and civil in tone. No members of Congress delivered speeches, probably because they weren't invited. One veteran who held a sign blaming Tea Party activists for the shutdown was asked by organizers to stand outside of the memorial grounds. That's how veterans respond when everybody is at risk. They go back as the Army veteran who received the Medal of Honor yesterday from the President, went back to even get his dead comrades. I want to ask perhaps Mr. Jarvis, perhaps the representative from the tourism industry to explain something that really alarmed me. Apparently, it's Mr. Simon who said that the shutdown will have lasting effects on international visitation. Now, of course, our international visits start here, but then they hear about all those wonderful sights, especially in the far west, and they don't want to go home without seeing them. Now, my Republican friends say, oh, you know, this will blow over just like a default will blow over. Could you tell me what you mean by lasting effects?
Will the gentlelady ask the question so we can get a response very quickly? Their time has expired.
Will you tell me about lasting effects and perhaps what we might do to keep these effects from becoming more lasting? Ms. Simon.
Ms. Simon, very quickly.
Yes. We anticipate well, let me start by saying the national parks is a huge part of what is promoted to international visitations through Brand USA, which is our federal marketing arm for tourism. And so we know that the international visitors are coming here to see the parks. They come into the gateways. They also see the parks generally on their first visits. So we anticipate there will be lasting effects in terms of international visitation, particularly in the fall as they look toward next year's trips coming in October and November.
Time of the gentlelady has expired. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Duncan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. A big part of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park is in my district, and without objection, I would like to place a statement by Blount County Mayor Ed Mitchell in the record. Mayor Mitchell has been a great leader in trying to find ways to open the park back up, and he's asked the Park Service to let the county operate the park, and has said that they could do so just as capably if allowed to do so. Of course, they weren't allowed to do so, but now fortunately our state has come up with really more money than is necessary to open the park back up until Sunday. There's a private community in the Smokies called Top of the World. 24 school children are picked up each day to go to school in the school bus. They were picked up when the morning the government shut down, and then the Park Service closed the road so that the school children could not get back home on their school bus after school, which I thought was a very sad and needless thing to have done. I've said many times that you can never satisfy government's appetite for money or land. They always want more. Along with more money, they always want more staff. And one thing this government slowdown has shown is that the Park Service is greatly overstaffed across this nation. Many thousands have visited the World War II Memorial and other monuments in spite of the barricades. Hundreds of thousands could safely and comfortably visit the Smokies and other national parks if the roads were not closed. These barricades and closures were obviously done to try to make the shutdown as unpopular as possible, as inconvenient as possible, and not because it was actually necessary. This is using the Park Service for political purposes. This is all shown, as I've said, that the Park Service is greatly overstaffed. Mr. Ebell has in his statement a quote from a former Secretary of the Interior who said the National Park Service has a long history of dramatizing budget issues by inconveniencing the public. They often choose the most dramatic type of action in order to get their message across. It's unfortunate that the Park Service has allowed itself or cooperates to cooperate in political purposes such as this. And there's been some mention here earlier by several members that the Republicans shut down the government. The Republicans in the House voted 4 different times to keep the entire government open before anything was shut down. But Senator Reid would not allow that to be taken up in the Senate. At this time, I yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Gov't.
Thank my friend very much. Let me mention, Director, because you called somebody earlier on hearsay. I'm going to give you something that's not hearsay. I was out there at the World War II Memorial on Tuesday morning because Representative Steve Palazzo of Mississippi emailed that he had a bunch of World War II veterans that were coming by bus, and there were barricades that had been put up. I get out there, sure enough, there are barricades on the north entrance, the south entrance, and the entrance facing the road had barricades across, and it had yellow tape woven in and out. They did not intend for anyone to cross that line, First Amendment or not. So whoever was supposed to get the message out about First Amendment protests did not. We went up and down the barricades. We talked to the park police. And by the way, on Wednesday when I was out there, I asked a park ranger, how many people normally are out here when we're not in shutdown? She said 4. Now, you could object to hearsay, except it's not hearsay. It's not for the evidence of the statement, of the facts asserted in the statement, but simply that the statement was made. So you could say maybe it wasn't 4, but whoever that park ranger that said they were out there every day seemed to think it was 4. And on Thursday and Friday, I can't remember if it was Thursday or Friday, I counted 9 Park Service people out there to protect the World War II Memorial from our World War II veterans. And I can tell you, if Steve Palazzo and I had not picked up the barricades, separated them after establishing with the Park Service who we were, those barricades were not going to be opened, and those World War II veterans were not being allowed in, First Amendment or otherwise. And that is not hearsay. I was there, and I watched with my own eyes. I heard with my own ears. I yield back.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Davis, is recognized. Turn on your microphone.
That I did. House Republicans have forced the government shutdown on the American people, and the testimony provided by some of the witnesses today highlights the local economic impact that this shutdown has on small towns and businesses that serve employees and visitors of our national parks. The National Park Service has estimated that the government shutdown will result in total economic losses of $76 million per day to local communities surrounding national parks. Director Jarvis, is that correct?
That is correct.
Thank you. Mayor Bryan, in your testimony, you stated that your town and the small businesses there estimate a loss of more than $1 million in revenue just during the first 7 days of the shutdown. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, it is.
In fact, one estimate found that Arizona will have the third largest economic impact of national park closures, amounting to almost $5 million a day. Marie Lopez Rogers, the current president of the National League of Cities, penned an op-ed titled, and I quote, "Federal Shutdown Has Dire Impact on Local Government," which described some of the practical impacts of the shutdown on residents and communities around the country. Ms. Lopez Rogers wrote, and I quote again, "The antics in Washington are threatening to unravel the progress our cities have made over the last few months and cause harm to the entire nation. It's a reckless approach to governing," end of quote. She went on to say, and I quote again, that every day the government is shut down is another day of economic uncertainty. We need to focus on what matters to our communities, our neighborhoods, and our residents. Director Jarvis, I've heard people indicate that somehow or another you did not provide the sensitivity that was necessary as you made some decisions. Do you contend and are you concerned that about the impact of shutdown on businesses and communities surrounding national parks?
Yes, sir. I'm very concerned about that. It was immediately upon the closure, we opened lines of communication with our concessioners in particular. These are the private sector businesses that operate food, beverage, and lodging within the parks, the National Hospitality Association. I even conducted a conference call with the CEOs and leaders of those organizations that first week to really begin to convey our concern, to talk about what we can do for them after the shutdown is over and what we can do in between. And as a result of those conversations, we really began on Wednesday of the first week, I contacted the people that were involved in 1995 in the agreement with the Grand Canyon to understand how that was negotiated. We even tracked down the former attorneys that negotiated that as well, so that we would have the information to build 20 years later, new rules and regulations and all of that, with a very small staff, how we could get these things back open so that we could reduce the impact to the tourism industry, which we rely upon.
Thank you very much. I commend you for your 40 years of service to the Park Service, and I have no further questions, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back his time. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gov't, recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Jarvis, I'm just curious, the philosophy that you have as Director of the Park Service, do you believe our rights come from our Creator or from our government and Constitution?
I believe they come from all of the above.
Well, check your Constitution. It's a Constitution that prohibits activities by the government, not give them rights. The Declaration of Independence established what our founders believed, where our rights came from. But Ms. Eberly, what has happened to you is pretty outrageous. You've heard all of the insults thrown out today about the shutdown, and I'm curious, were you notified before October 1st, that Tuesday, that you might be closed even though you had been operating totally independent and you had saved the farm because of your efforts in your 32 years as director? When were you notified you were being shut down?
I had a phone call on my cell phone from the superintendent Monday late morning, and I returned it early afternoon. I was out of town.
Okay, and what were you told in that conversation?
We were told, or I was told, that the farm was going to be part of the shutdown. And I said, but we've never been part of other shutdowns. And he said, well, it will be illegal for you to open the farm, and if you do, then you risk arrest, and only one employee, only one private employee will be allowed in to feed the animals.
How many National Park Service employees are at your farm each day?
None. Not since 1981 when we
Now wait a minute. We've heard about the law being that in a shutdown you have to revert to minimum manpower unless there is a specific threat. Are you aware of any threats that were emanating from the Claude Moore farm on September 30th or October 1st?
No, we're pretty low-key. Not only that, but our next-door neighbor is the CIA, so they pretty much take care of any threats that might come along.
So you're not worried the CIA is a threat to the Claude Moore farm, apparently?
Nope. They're our best friends.
How about, I read that the McLean Chamber of Commerce had paid a bunch of money to use the farm on October 1st in the evening for a gathering. Were there any indications that the McLean Chamber of Commerce was a threat to your farm?
No.
Had they ever been a threat to your farm? I mean, chambers can be pretty rowdy.
Yeah, they can. This one's pretty okay, and we belong, so.
All right, so what happened on Tuesday?
Tuesday, the employees came in as normal because we decided we weren't going to leave the farm unprotected. And I had asked for this decision in writing because we had received nothing in writing. And so the superintendent emailed me a statement about 3:30 on Monday, and we appealed that, thinking that we could get it changed, thinking that this was just sort of a boo-boo. And then about 2 o'clock on Tuesday, we got a phone call saying, no, absolutely no. And then Park Police showed up and made the chamber members and all the people setting up for the event leave.
On Monday, when you returned the call of the superintendent from the Park Service, did they say your park might be closed to be on alert, or what did they say?
They said if the government shut down, then we would be a part of the shutdown, and that they had had this plan in place since Thursday, but that was the first notice we had received.
All right, and so did you happen to notice how many Park Service police came out to run off the McLean Chamber of Commerce and put up the barricades?
I wasn't there.
Okay, do you know where the barricades came from?
They brought them. Not the Park Police, the Park Maintenance crews brought them.
The Park Maintenance crew brought them. Have you ever had Park Maintenance crews out there since you became an independent operated park or farm?
Oh, yeah. I mean, early on, the Parkway Maintenance crews were very helpful to me.
Early on being when?
In 1981.
Okay, but in the last 13 years, have there ever been any Park Maintenance Service people come out to your farm?
To perform maintenance?
To do anything?
I think a broken water line, but that was probably about 9 years ago, maybe.
All right, thank you. My time's expired, but I would note for the chairman that the law was violated by the Park Service in sending police and maintenance personnel out to the park?
To the extent this is being recorded, that's part of the record. The gentlelady from Guam, Ms. Bordello, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too would like to commend Mr. Jarvis and for his long, many years of service to the National Park Service and also to all of the witnesses here. Mr. Jarvis, the shutdown was the final hit to the national parks after years of cuts in your budget, and I think you mentioned this earlier in your testimony, and to your operations and construction accounts. Can you speak about how the cuts in funding over the last several years have impacted your organization?
In a number of ways, they've impacted us. In terms of our facilities, we are in steady decline. Most of the facilities in many of our classic national parks were built 50, 75 years ago, water systems, wastewater systems, roads, and the like. So we now have an $11 billion maintenance backlog that is declining. We receive less than half of what we would need in order to just maintain that. On the other side is our ranger staff, those that provide interpretation, visitor protection has also been in decline, and so we are not capable of providing the level of visitor service that really the public expects and deserves.
Thank you. As the National Park Service gears up for its 100 years in 2016, what do the continued cuts mean to the future of the National Park Service? What are you, I'm sure it must be very impactful.
Well, a couple of things that we're working on. One is to develop as many partnerships with states, with nonprofit organizations, with the tourism associations to assist us in providing these places. We cannot do it alone. Increasing our volunteer workforce, increasing philanthropy, leveraging what dollars that we have both appropriated and non-appropriated, such as our fee dollars. All of those, we're looking at as many opportunities as possible. There have been a hearing in the Senate on a variety of ways we can find additional funding for the National Park Service leading up to the centennial. We are also working with the National Tour Association, the Hospitality Association, and Brand USA on a major marketing campaign for 2016. We feel that the national parks are an integral part of this American economy, as well as standing for really the best of this country, and we believe the centennial is a huge opportunity to remind all Americans of their national parks, as well as draw tourism from around the world.
Thank you, Director Jarvis. It's commendable that you're thinking ahead and you're looking into all these possibilities to continue on. Now, what is the impact with your employees? I mean, the overall morale and so forth of those still on duty and those that you had to furlough? I know a couple of my colleagues.
This is extremely, and thank you for this question, because it's extremely painful to the employees that are on furlough. They want to work. They want to be back in the parks. They want to be greeting the American public, along with the rest of the federal government. For the employees that are on duty, this is extremely difficult. You know, our rangers, our U.S. Park Police are accustomed to welcoming the public. We are I think, the only federal agency that has enjoyment in its mandate. It is a part of our mission to provide these places so that the public can enjoy them unimpaired for future generations. And right now we're having to turn people away because of the shutdown and the lapse of appropriations, and that is very, very difficult. Now, I have instructed, in spite of what you're hearing here today, I've instructed my law enforcement folks to take a very low-key approach to enforcement at the park level, to not confront, to stand back and just inform the American public that these places are closed. And as a consequence, there have been very, very few citations across the country. It's mostly been a respectful reminder to the American public when they come, obviously with their disappointment. It's, again, extraordinarily difficult and painful for us to have to deliver that message, and we hope that this will end very soon and we can open all 400 more.
And I do, with the few seconds I have left, Mr. Jarvis, I do suppose the ones that are not furloughed feel sort of guilty with other colleagues that had to be furloughed, that they're still on, and the others have been, furloughed. So I can imagine it must be a morale problem as well in the agency. And I thank you very much again for your service, and I yield back my time.
The gentlelady yields back. We now go to the gentleman from Colorado, but prior to that, I'm going to ask unanimous consent so that it be in the record for later discussion, and we'll have a copy of it given to the Director. This is the donation agreement for the National Park Service from the State of Oregon, from the State of Arizona back in the 90s, and it details it. What the Chairman said was a template. I might note that instead of $96,000 a day, it was $17,000 a day. So after you get a copy of it, I hope you can explain the inflation rate over this period of time. The gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Jarvis, this is painful for me because I do love and support and appreciate the National Park System, and to see what you've done really pains me, and to have this conversation. I have been to over 200 units of the National Park Service. Like I said, I love the parks. Many of those visits with my wife and children. And yet, when I was at the World War II Memorial, the second day of the slowdown, and I helped move the barricades because those World War II veterans should not have been denied their access. It was so reprehensible. I talked to one gentleman there who was in a wheelchair. I asked him how old he was. He was 97 years old, and he had fought in the Pacific Theater in World War II in Guadalcanal, among other places. And yet he wasn't being allowed, had those barricades stood, he wasn't being allowed to touch or see the plaques where the fallen are memorialized, his buddies. My own father could never make it out there. He turned 93 years old before he died, but he was never in good enough health to go out there. And so it was wrong what you did. This decision of yours was not good. It was not good for the American people, and it's not good for the park system either. Like I say, I appreciate the park system, and yet I think you've besmirched its reputation, and you have soured its relationship with Congress. And in my opinion, sir, you have failed, and you are a liability to the National Park Service. I do have a couple of questions I'd like to ask you about. Whose decision was it to try to shut down Mount Vernon? Mount Vernon is privately owned and operated. I know there's some parking off to the side that you have responsibility for. Was that your decision also to try to shut down Mount Vernon?
I think you're incorrect in that regard. We did not try to shut down Mount Vernon. We barricaded one parking lot that belongs to the National Park Service, and that was done in execution of the closure order for all 401 national parks. That parking lot is part of the George Washington Memorial Parkway. It did not block the use of Mount Vernon.
Well, if people can't park there, I don't know how they can
There are many parking lots at Mount Vernon. This is just one.
Okay. Was that your decision, though?
I was not involved in that decision directly, no, sir.
I'd like to ask about reimbursement to the states. My own state of Colorado is one of the 4 or so states that have talked with National Park Service about paying for continuing the Park Service until this government slowdown is over. Will states like Colorado be fully reimbursed for their expenses that they are incurring right now?
Not unless Congress authorizes it.
The document that Chairman Issa just had introduced into the record shows, this is from 1995-96, that the pattern was in the past that states would be reimbursed. If they're paying for things like salaries of park rangers, maintenance, law enforcement, and so on, and then those people don't have to be reimbursed later by you, because that would be, I'm assuming they wouldn't get twice their salary. I assume they only get paid once. So when you get reimbursed, that's a windfall to you if you don't reimburse the states.
Well, here's the way it actually works. So the states are depositing a set amount that we negotiate with the governors into the Treasury. And as soon as we open the parks, we're charging against that account. So that account is drawn down. Now, if the shutdown ends before we expend all of that money, then whatever is remaining absolutely will be immediately returned to the states. But for the money that is charged against, I have no authority then to take federal dollars that once reimbursed by when the shutdown ends and give that to the states unless directly authorized by Congress, which I would support, by the way, but I don't have that authority just outright.
So at this point in time, you're not pledging to reimburse the states?
No, we made it very clear in each of these agreements, and very clear in the agreement that was negotiated, that there is no guarantee that they're going to get this money back. It would only be if Congress were to authorize it.
Well, I think you should have to be responsible for that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I might note for the record that in every case of shutdowns, all federal employees have been paid and these types of debts have been paid. So there's a high expectation, even not a contract. We now go to the gentleman from Virginia for his round of questions. Mr. Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to the panel. Ms. Eberly, I've been to the Claude Moore farm many times, and thank you for running such a beautiful spot in our community. By the way, the land on which the Claude Moore Colonial Farm is located, is that federally owned or is that privately owned?
It's federally owned.
Federally owned.
Mm-hmm. Former landfill.
Okay. So could it be that Director Jarvis, looking at the Anti-Deficiency Act and trying to figure out what's covered and what isn't, looks at a place like Claude Moore, federally owned land? You manage it, but it's federally owned, and it gets a subsidy of $100,000 a year, apparently down to $92,000 this year because of sequestration, and down to zero next year because of budget cuts. That he might have just included that in the sort of the larger penumbra of the Anti-Deficiency Act and things he might have to decide. Could that be an explanation?
I was told by the superintendent that it was entirely his decision.
Which superintendent?
The Parkway superintendent.
The Parkway superintendent.
Mm-hmm. And he had decided to leave open the Memorial Bridge and the George Washington Memorial Parkway.
And from your point of view, well, you obviously didn't like the decision, none of us did, but it was also a matter of communication. Explaining the rationale was not very consistent from your point of view.
We've never gotten an explanation.
Okay. Director Jarvis.
Because now we're open.
Director Jarvis, I'd like you to address that in a second, but you said 401 national parks, is that correct?
That's correct.
Would Claude Moore and, say, the Mount Vernon parking lot be included in that number, or are they, because they're sort of hybrids, are they over and above the 401?
No, they're components of those 401. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of similar situations as to the Claude Moore farm within those 401.
Okay. And you were advised, presumably by your ethics office or by your attorneys, when you go about to organize for the shutdown, in anticipation of the shutdown, that you're going to have to make thousands of discrete decisions in a very collapsed time frame, and you are concerned about complying both with the law, that is to say the shutdown, and with the Anti-Deficiency Act. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Would you remind us what the Anti-Deficiency Act is and does?
Essentially, it is a statute that prohibits doing work for which there is no federal appropriation, except for the limitations on protection of life and property. And so in the case of Claude Moore, if I may, the Claude Moore farm has, since 2001, received $1.3 million of federal appropriations from the National Park Service. We recently spent several $100,000 repairing their sewer system. We do ongoing food and safety inspections, trash removal, and road maintenance. So we had to evaluate, in the case of Claude Moore, case of of dozens of these, of whether or not we would be in violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act by allowing these to continue to operate. And so, if you may, let me just say we took the closure date on October 1, and then we began to evaluate each of these operations individually to ensure that we were not violating them. And those that we felt we could honestly and clearly and legally reopen, we have done that.
By the way, I have a limited amount of time left, but I want to say, at least speaking for this member, I just heard my colleague from Colorado make some rather strong statements about you and your service. I completely disavow those comments. I think you have been an exemplary public servant. I think you've done the best you could under very trying circumstances. I think you've put up with some criticism because some, no one here, of course, want to deflect public attention from their own actions, namely the consequences of a shutdown. But to trash somebody's good reputation who has served his country well, as a labor of love as well as your professional commitment to the national parks and making them the best they can be, I just want you to know there are many of us here and many throughout the country who very much value your service and deeply regret any suggestions that somehow you're responsible for the shutdown and the consequences. I have 7 seconds, Mr. Chairman, but I'll be glad to yield.
Well, I just want to point out, and I thank the gentleman for yielding real quickly. I just understand that the Anti-Deficiency Act goes back to the 1860s, and yet it was not employed in 1995 for whatever reason. I just thought, for the record, that ought to be it. And I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Mr. Chairman, could I at least ask?
You can have your 6 seconds.
Thank you. Mr. Galvin, is that true or not?
It's not true. The Anti-Deficiency Act ruled the shutdown in 95, 96 the same way it does now.
Thank you, gentlemen.
The same ways.
I'll now recognize myself. Director Jarvis, do you remember April of this year coming before one of these committees, the Oversight Committee?
Yes, sir.
And between April 16th and October 1st, you were not shut down. You had the ability to operate fully. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So for those many months after you promised to deliver us the discovery, including 400 pages previously identified before that hearing, and didn't do so, you did so out of contempt for your promise to this committee? Or was it just an oversight? Do you just not know that you promised to deliver documents related to discovery and you don't do it?
No, sir. Those decisions are made by the Department of the Interior.
Well, I'm going to take that decision away from you. I will be issuing a subpoena to you before the close of this hearing, and I will expect, as soon as the government reopens, for you to comply with it. Additionally, I'm going to ask our clerks to go through the record and find each and every document and request made during this hearing, and again, issue a subpoena, since it's very clear that the promises you make have no value because someone in the Department of Interior simply doesn't bother to deliver documents already known. And those documents are related to our accusation of prior abuse under sequestration. So Mr. Connolly may want to say you're exemplary. I find it questionable. Let me ask you a very simple question I started this hearing with. Whose land is it? Is it your land? Is it the government land? Or do you oversee the people's land? And please think before you answer.
It's the people's land.
If it's the people's land, then don't you have an obligation to absolutely positively mitigate to the greatest extent possible the adverse effects on people?
I operate under the law passed.
I know. Don't tell me about the law. Do you have an obligation? You're restrained by laws, but do you have an obligation to deliver to the best of your ability with the limited funds you may or may not have?
I absolutely do.
Then in the case of Ms. Eberly, isn't it true that in fact every day her organization saves the American people money they would otherwise spend to operate that park, or the park would be gone? Isn't that true? You kept talking about the $1 million you delivered. She delivered twice, 3 times, 4 times that in value through volunteers, through fundraising. Isn't that true?
Absolutely. We love our partners.
Okay. So here's your public-private partner, and you shut her down and cost her far more than any potential savings. You spent money to barricade so that she, in fact, couldn't operate, and you did so without prior notice. And let me ask you an important question. What was the first day in your job? You talked about 2016 and what you're anticipating and who you're working with. What was the first day you began asking the question, over the last year, we'll just use 2013, what do I do in the case of a shutdown related to a lack of appropriations? What was the first day?
Well, we were facing a potential shutdown in 2011 when the debt
Okay,
hit
so
we've
since 2011, your testimony is that, in fact, you've known there's a potential for a shutdown.
That's correct.
You were with the Park Service and you were aware of the agreement made with Arizona in 1996. You were aware, could have been aware, of course, Ms. Eberly was not shut down back then. You were aware that, contrary to what was shown in an earlier picture, that, in fact, the Lincoln Memorial was not closed, as that picture falsely shows, at some earlier barricade. This is a repair period of time. It may, in fact, be an actual picture, but the pictures we have seen show that people walked up. This barricade was not, in fact, keeping people from going. People went all the way up. You'll notice, Mr. DeFazio, you'll notice the construction. This picture is also from that period and shows people actually being seen with the sign up there, going there. The fact is, you had a history and a tradition. Why did you not make the effort and the contacts to find out how to mitigate? Why did you not talk to the mayor's people or representatives? Why was there not an attempt to see what they could do to mitigate it? Why were those contracts not dusted off in preparation? Why didn't you do anything to mitigate this whenever possible? And why did you cause Ms. Eberly to sit there and lose money and perhaps her organization go into an inability to maintain it when, in fact, you know and I know that that road maintenance is being deferred whether she's open or closed? Isn't that true?
I immediately, upon the closure, began to look at the documents from the Grand Canyon.
Okay, that's a great answer, and my time is expiring. You waited till after October 1st and then began, after you asserted pain on people through a lack of planning, you began planning so that a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks after you'd made your point, that you could punish the American people by shutting down and taking away assets they cared about. Then you began, because of public opinion, opening back up. For the record, isn't it true that everything you've done to reopen could have been anticipated and done in advance? In other words, if you can reopen her parking lot, then in fact you had the authority never to close it. Isn't that true? The 1860s law didn't change, so isn't it true?
In all due respect, the National Park Service is a very big, complex organization. I did not know about Claude Moore any more than the dozens of others out there. I rely on my field representatives, my superintendents, to tell me, and so what we had to do is we shut it down in compliance with the lapse of appropriations and then immediately began assessing which ones we could reopen. And we did that with Claude Moore. I have over a dozen here more that we've reopened, as well as all
the Grand Canyon's, kind of hard. It gets overlooked. You didn't see it. And we all know that terrorists are going to go in and blow up the Grand Canyon, too. So, the fact that you overlooked the Grand Canyon is not credible. We go to the gentlelady from Massachusetts now for her questions. Ms. Tsongas.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Jarvis, for being here. As I said in my early comments, I do have two national parks. They really do commemorate. One commemorates the American Revolution. The other commemorates the Industrial Revolution. These communities are the communities that host these national parks take such pride in all the great work you do and the tremendous leadership you've brought, the high standards you create, and we as an American people, I think, are proud of those standards and hate to see anything happen that undermines them, as the sequester is certainly doing and is shutting down the government is doing. But I want to address first the whole issue of our veterans' access to the World War II Memorial. My father was a survivor of Pearl Harbor. He went on to serve across the South Pacific. He is no longer living, but I can't imagine that he would not be so dismayed by the circus that's been created around the access issue to the memorial. And I happened to be in the airport when an honor flight group was coming from Arkansas. It was a very celebratory moment. These were
older men who are so proud of their service to this country. And it was a touching thing to be near them. I just want to reference that Politico Today reports that despite my Republican colleague attempts to turn the World War II Memorial into the government shutdown's poster child, quote, veterans streaming into Washington to see the monument don't really face any obstacles in their visits, and many complain that they are being used for political gain, unquote. Jim McLaughlin, a lead organizer for the Honor Flight Network, told Political, quote, we have had no problems at all, end quote. He said the Park Service has been, quote, very cooperative and very polite, unquote, in allowing veterans groups to visit under the auspices that they're conducting, quote, First Amendment activities, unquote. Director Jarvis, veterans have been able to visit the World War II Memorial, haven't they?
Yes, ma'am, they have.
Thank you. I'd also like to go back to the issue, and I thank you, Ms. Simon, for your testimony. Are we really surprised that the government shutdown would have an impact on our gateway communities, on our tourism industry? It isn't just something one could have foreseen?
I don't think the fact that there was an impact was a surprise. No, I think everyone anticipated it. It was really not knowing what to expect come the first day of the shutdown.
And that is why it is such a dismaying activity, given that it could have been avoided. A bill could have been brought to the floor that would have Democratic support, the Senate bill that was passed by the Senate on a bipartisan basis, brought to the floor of the House of Representatives, supported by Democrats, supported by Republicans, and would have avoided this altogether. The national parks are where a lot of the discussion is going because they're very visible to the American people, and it's happening at a moment in time when visitation has historically been very high. But I don't think we can overlook all the other people and all the other institutions that have been so impacted. Last week, I had a heart-wrenching conversation with a nurse at a military installation in my district who is furloughed because of the Republican shutdown. As a federal contract employee, she is terrified that she won't be able to recover her lost pay, putting her family at financial risk. Quote, we are the ones suffering, unquote, she told me. Quote, we are hardworking Americans working paycheck to paycheck. Something like this can destroy us, unquote. We have to remember the service members who have returned from combat duty who may lose their college tuition assistance that they've been promised. Clinical trials for cancer patients have been delayed, and veterans are being told that they will have to wait even longer to have their benefit claims reviewed. And yes, it is so unfortunate that our national parks, some of our nation's most treasured sites, are closed to the public. But that is what happens when the federal government shuts down. We need to end this and end it today. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. We now go to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Walberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the panel for being here. I certainly agree with one of my colleagues who mentioned it earlier on the other side of the aisle, that we live in a parallel universe of fact and of fiction. 5 years of government by crisis has been taking place, beginning with the first 2 years of this administration when the Democrats controlled the White House, the Senate, and the House. A budget wasn't passed either of those 2 years. Continuing resolutions certainly work toward crisis, don't they? And now we've come to a big crisis where the Democrat shutdown of this government has taken place. Now, they would call it something else. And they've been effective with the use of pawns in the media and pawns, sadly, in the bureaucracy, Mr. Jarvis, of making pain on the American public. But I'm concerned more about the pain that's been put on the private sector economy. Mayor Bryan, Ms. Eberly, tourist associations. This was knowingly done. I'm concerned about the pain that will be coming even worse for Mayor Bryan and Ms. Eberly and other private concessionaires. When Obamacare has its full results and we have a part-time economy, not a full-time economy, because then it won't be a shutdown that stops people from visiting these wonderful sites that Director Jarvis, I visited when I was just a kid, that led me in 1969 to go to Western Illinois University majoring in forestry and land management. Over 40 years ago, my intentions were to be in the service that you're in. And since that time, I've visited parks all over this country in 50 states. And I still do with my grandkids. But in the future, they won't have that opportunity because of an economy that has gone to a part-time economy. And our people, maybe not foreigners, which we hope continue to come, but our people won't be able to afford to go to see that magnificent Grand Canyon that I saw as a boy and as a teenager and as a college student and as a father. I'm sick of hearing of this shutdown called anything other than a Democrat shutdown. We have offered 4 bills to fund the entire government, rejected by the Senate-controlled Senate. We've offered now 15 bills to open up necessary components of government. Oh, and by the way, one of those was the Park Service and the monuments. One of those was the Veterans Administration, WIC, and I could go on down the line, rejected in the Senate, supported in a bipartisan fashion in the House. Where's the problem? Let me ask a question. Ms. Eberly, I heard you interviewed on TV, I think after the first week. I appreciated your spunk. What has this cost you, or cost the Colonial Farm?
So far, probably about $30,000, I guess. That probably doesn't seem like very much money down here, but to us it is.
To you it does. $20,000 when I first toured you, so it's got him $10,000 more.
Yeah.
My brother, without me, took a motorcycle trip along the Blue Ridge Parkway just a few weeks back, well, the week before the shutdown. Had dinner at the Pisgah Inn. I've been there myself. Beautiful part of the world. A week later, it shut down, a private concessionary, making money for the U.S. Park Service. Let me ask a question, Director Jarvis. What does the Park Service think will happen if they don't close private businesses?
Private businesses that are both within and outside the national parks are essential to public service. I mean, that's so we have Pisgah Inn, Peaks of Otter, Northwest Trading Post, Folk Arts Center, and the Mabry Mill are all open as a result of the policy change I made to get them open along the Blue Ridge.
How many others are closed still?
I don't really know, but I've opened over a dozen. Cliff House, the Avon Pier at Cape Hatteras, a number of these that really do not require our support and do not violate the Anti-Deficiency Act.
And hundreds are still closed.
I've opened the window for anybody to request, and we are evaluating each one of those requests.
Well, let me just, because my time is 9 seconds here, and I would refer to you as well as Mr. Galvin. 1995, we had a shutdown. 1995 to the present, Mr. Gavin, we had the opportunity to put in place for that large government entity called the Park Service to put in plans so this type of thing wouldn't happen. You say it's large and it takes a lot of effort. Well, it sure does. But why wasn't it taken care of between 1995 and now? I contend it was because we wanted to inflict pain upon the taxpayer, the citizen, to make them go along with policies that will ultimately make it more problem for Mayor Bryan, Ms. Eberly, and others. And
I thank the gentleman. I now ask unanimous consent to place in the record a letter